Pop's Grocery was the kind of place that sold bait in the morning and beer in the evening. A little bit of everything but a lot of nothing, all at a higher price than what the big supermarket chains could afford. The dusty two-lane road in front of Pop's hadn't seen much traffic since the highway had been built. Weeds grew in the cracks of its asphalt parking lot. The white-painted brick was peeling. The lights were dim, the shelves half empty. The place hurt to look at, especially since I could remember what it used to be like. I had grown up shopping there with my grandfather, and back then, Pop's Grocery was the heart of the community. When I moved back to my hometown, I wanted to save it, and I had a feeling that the data was on my side. Upscale suburbs and shipping warehouses were sprouting like mushrooms all around Pop's. The county's tax base and population were growing for a change. People were passing by the old store again. People with empty refrigerators and growling stomachs who might be willing to pay a little more to shop locally. Or so I hoped. The plan looked fine on paper, when the impossibly large quantities of money involved were all just imaginary. Real life, however, was a different story. My heart was in my throat as I walked into the manager's office to begin the negotiations. I could feel the employees watching me, knowing that everything was about to be in my hands. If I screwed this up, I wouldn't be the only one going bankrupt. The manager's office itself didn't exactly give the impression of modernity and success. Soggy greenish-gray carpet, mismatched furniture, stained ceiling tiles, and ugly yellow walls. I moved to close the door, but Steve Couch, the fourth-generation owner of the place, shook his head. "I'll leave it open." He reached into his desk and offered me an ancient cigar. I realized that as far as Steve was concerned, the negotiations were already over. Pop's Grocery was mine, and he was glad to see it go. I was honestly surprised. The numbers that he had shown me about these stores' profits were bad, but they weren't that bad. Pop's had been in the Couch family for over 70 years, and I had expected Steve to put up more of a fight. Instead, he had told me about his plans to retire to Florida and said that his lawyer would be in touch. The amount of information that I had to take in during those first days was overwhelming. I misplaced documents, mixed up the names and faces of my new employees, and felt a deepening sense of dread as Steve Couch walked me through the store, cheerfully explaining all the work that needed to be done. I stayed late that first Friday night, wandering through Pop's Grocery after closing time at 8:30. I needed to clear my head, to remind myself why I was doing all of this in the first place. I ran my fingers along the polished chrome of the dairy section, admired the neon signs and checkered tiles. Alone in the old store after hours, I had the uncanny feeling that I was back in the past, like no time had passed at all. A loud crash jolted me out of my reminiscing. I felt the blood rush from my face, and I had locked the doors. Nobody else should have been in the store at this time. Was someone taking advantage of the chaotic transition, using it as an opportunity to steal from Pop's? They would have to be desperate or insane to rob a failing grocery store. Desperate, insane, maybe even violent. Just a few days ago, I had read an article about a meth addict who had crushed a man's skull during a mugging gone bad. I didn't think that my little hometown had a major drug problem. But then again, I had been away for a long time. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the empty space. Without the beeping checkout lanes and the background conversations, the silence in Pop's felt ominous, even menacing. I found myself looking nervously over my shoulder as I jogged toward the source of the noise, somewhere in the back of the cereal section. 2 minutes later, I paused, panting. The end of the aisle wasn't any closer. In fact, it was like I hadn't moved at all. I took a deep breath, trying to get myself under control. It wasn't impossible. I mean, physics didn't work like that. Yet when I ran all out toward the glowing neon sign above the deli section, it actually seemed to get further away. The lights flickered suddenly. It felt like a warning. Hadn't Steve Couch said that the writing in Pops needed to be updated? That the power sometimes just went out? Panicking, I turned backward in the direction that I had come from. But I could no longer see the front of the store. It was lost in hazy darkness. I could feel myself beginning to hyperventilate. To get my breathing under control, I tried to center my attention on the products around me. At first, they looked just like these standard bakery items available in any supermarket. But only at first. Bread, spelled B-R-E-D, read the plastic wrap loaf in front of me. I almost laughed. It was a misprint, it had to be. The stuff inside was greenish black and lumpy. I was reaching out for it when it flopped off of the shelf and landed on the beige tile floor in front of me. It flailed wildly like the contents were trying to gnaw their way out. I backed away with a shudder. The products looked almost exactly like the ones I knew, but there was something wrong with all of them. I could feel it, and that wasn't all. Was it just me, or was something moving in the next aisle? I didn't call out any greeting this time. I didn't know what was going on, but I was certain of one thing. Someone or something in Pop's grocery wished me harm. A loud creak. A hideous metallic groan boomed through the store, so loud it felt like the walls themselves were being rearranged. I glanced up at the neon deli sign. It looked as far away as a distant star, but at least it gave me something to move toward, as quickly and quietly as I could. 10 minutes passed, and then 20. All I could do was keep walking. That metallic groan was closer now and louder. I sprinted, careless of the dizzying way the aisle stretched out beneath my feet. Just when I thought that I couldn't run any further, the fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker out one by one. Darkness closed in on me like a wave. Instinct had taken over, the animal part of my brain pushing my aching legs beyond what they would ordinarily have been capable of. I nearly slipped on the oversized cereal box on the floor in front of me. I stared at it stupidly, suddenly remembering why I had gone down the aisle in the first place. Looking back over my shoulder, the lights were back on and I could hear footsteps. "Can I get that for you, honey?" A scream rose in my throat when I heard the woman's husky voice, but it was just Irene, the longest-serving employee of Pop's grocery. The original Pop had hired her when she was a teenager, and according to local gossip, she had also raised 3 of his illegitimate children. Their names, Debbie, Snyder, and Oscar, were allegedly based on the product boxes atop which they had been conceived. I suppose the kids were lucky that none of them had ended up with Kit Kat or Ho-Ho. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, with all the authority of a limp noodle. "Well, somebody locked the front door while I was having a smoke." Irene grinned. "So I had to come around back." I checked my watch. I had been running down that horrible aisle for what felt like hours. How could it be that just 5 minutes had passed? Irene's watchful green eyes took in the sweat on my forehead and my pale, frightened face. She chose her next words carefully. It's not a good idea to be all alone in a big store like this. You never know what might happen. You okay? I nodded, but I practically clung to Irene's apron strings as she finished looking up and headed into the foggy parking lot for one last cigarette. I remember you, you know, she said suddenly when we had reached our cars. You used to come in here with your grandpa. He would buy fish bait, diet soda, and a cheese and egg sandwich every Saturday morning like clockwork. He used to push you around in a shopping cart. She exhaled a cloud of smoke and looked back at the dark hulk of Pop's grocery. You really think you can turn this place around? I hope so, I answered honestly. Yeah, me too. I got grandkids to feed, and God knows my deadbeat daughters aren't going to get them jobs themselves. Irene hopped into her driver's seat with the agility of somebody half her age. I swallowed nervously and bent down beside her driver's side window. Look, I began. None of the books that I've read on management had a chapter on how to thank an employee who just saved your life. It probably isn't a good idea to hang around the parking lot for too long either, Irene said pointedly, and then revved her engine and winked. With a smile, I slid behind the wheel of my own car and followed her taillights into the darkness. I began remodeling Pop's grocery the very next day. Maybe it was foolish to hope that whatever haunted the store that I had bought could be exorcised by a few coats of fresh paint, but I had to start somewhere. Besides, in the back of my mind, I still secretly hoped that there might be a logical explanation for what I had experienced. My wife theorized that what had happened to me was a hallucination caused by stress, and there was definitely enough of that to go around. Steve Couch had claimed that nothing in Pop's grocery had been updated since Reagan was president, and he hadn't been exaggerating. The first thing that I wanted to replace were the ancient fluorescent lights, which, as I had already experienced, would flicker and go out unexpectedly. The PA system was a close second. I had already had 2 electricians come and take a look at it, but neither could explain the unnerving metallic groans that sometimes emanated from the speakers, or the way they seemed to pick up other frequencies, like the screaming man. Russell Hughes, 315-4517. The frantic voice would boom, warbled and chopped with static. This is Russell Hughes, 315-4517. If anybody can hear this, send help. Russell Hugh. Sooner or later, the man's plea disappeared, swallowed up by the shopping music. At first, I thought it was just the staff playing a strange prank. The third time it happened, I called a meeting in the break room and told these 7 employees on duty that we needed to talk about the noises coming from the PA system. When I did, every face went pale. Erica Hawkins, a skinny red-headed teenager who had only been at Pop's grocery for 2 months, immediately raised her hand to speak. Erica said that she had been opening the store one morning when she had heard a female voice humming softly from the speaker above her. Erica recognized the tune. It was a song her mother, Tanya, had hummed to her when she was a baby, and Tanya Hawkins had been dead for years. Unnerved, Erica had hurried to the other side of the store, but the humming followed. It went from speaker to speaker, getting louder and more aggressive until Erica was curled up beside the ice chest, with her hands pressed over her ears, sobbing. When her coworkers shook her and asked what was wrong, none of them could hear a thing. Seconds later, the humming ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Erica had taken her 15-minute break, chugged an iced frappuccino, and went back to work as though nothing had happened. When Erica finished her story, the break room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I looked nervously from face to face. "Has anybody else experienced anything unusual while working here?" I asked. "Hey, it's okay, just raise your hand." All 7 employees looked at one another, and then lifted their hands slowly into the air. I blinked. "Well, I just want you all to know that I'm going to look into it." No response. Irene coughed. "Are we done here? I could use a smoke." I broke up the meeting and hurried back to the manager's office. Like the break room, it was an insult to interior designers everywhere. Gray and green carpet, hideous yellow walls, and 3 generations of chipped fake wood furniture. I tried to place a call to the previous owner, but Steve Kelch wasn't available for comment. Apparently he had followed through with his plan to sell everything and move off to Florida, without leaving any forwarding address. Steve Kelch's voicemail wasn't set up either. As I listened to the dial tone, I drummed my fingers irritably against the desk and noticed something odd. The manager's desk almost sounded hollow. I ran my thumb along the edge until I felt a click. A latch released and the top of the desk lifted upward, revealing a pile of yellowed papers. Most of them were business documents, but at the bottom of the pile I found a handwritten list going back all the way to when Pop's Grocery first had opened up in the 60s. It was a list of names and dates. There was Frank Kelch, the first owner of Pop's, who had died of a heart attack while opening the store. There was Russell Hughes, the mysterious voice in the PA system. And then I saw a third name that made my blood run cold. Edgar Lee, my grandfather. I had been told that he had gone missing while on a fishing trip in 2005. So what was his name doing on a weird list hidden in the manager's office at Pop's Grocery? And he wasn't the only one who had run into bad luck either. A quick online search revealed that every one of the 11 individuals on the list were either missing or dead. A chill ran through me. Just what kind of list was I looking at here? Suddenly, I heard a creaking sound overhead. The ceiling tiles above me had warped and bent, like something heavy was crawling right above me. I looked up and realized that the door to the manager's office had shut, even though I couldn't remember closing it myself. I felt a chill as I remembered Irene's warning. It's not a good idea to be all alone in a big store like this. You never know what might happen. Something that might have been drool dribbled onto my shoulder from the black gap between these sagging tiles. I grabbed the strange list, sprang out of my chair, and bolted for the door. Dust rained down as the thing in the ceiling gave chase. I burst out of my office and into my office again. The ugly yellow paint and fake wood furniture were identical to the room that I had just left. Only this time, there were 4 doors instead of 1. I couldn't help but wonder where they led, and what might be waiting for me on the other side. A sudden slam knocked my hand off of the doorknob. The wood behind me splintered. Something was trying to knock down the door. I went into the room on the left, and I wasn't surprised that it was yet another version of my office again. No matter how many doors I opened, the result was always the same. 12 rooms later, the noises behind me had gone quiet. I pressed my ear against the cool wood of the door. Maybe whatever was chasing me had given up, or was it just sneaking up on me from a different direction? I could see it as clearly as one of my childhood night terrors. The door across from me would creak open theatrically, revealing only blackness. A grinning, red-eyed thing would walk out of those shadows. It would take its time enjoying this, knowing that I had nowhere to run. It would pull me apart and devour me right there on the pea-green carpet. And that would be the last that anybody would hear of the out-of-towner who tried to save Pop's grocery. The room spun. I leaned back against the wall trying to get control of myself, and I felt something odd. Someone had strung a fishing line along it. The wire led to the door on the left and continued on the other side. I followed it left and then right again. As I did, I noticed how large, sinister X's had been carved into several doors. Even more disturbingly, a few had been barricaded shut with furniture. I kept following the fishing wire. It occurred to me that it might be a trap, but what choice did I have? Continue wandering through those hideous offices until I died of dehydration, or the thing in the ceiling finally caught up to me. Finally, I staggered into a room whose walls were splattered with gore. The fishing line dragged loosely along the floor, as though whoever had been placing it had been injured, perhaps fatally. Their bloody trail through the middle door. The corpse in the next room was so fresh that the man could have been killed only seconds ago, but his outfit was from another era. He wore bell-bottom jeans, a striped shirt with a wide open collar, and a shag hairdo that was sticky with blood. His eyes, ears, nose, and tongue were all missing. The fishing wire that I had been following through those nightmarish rooms ended in his right hand, and his left arm was reaching toward the door across the room. I had just stooped down to inspect the body when I heard a familiar creaking in the ceiling. I didn't think twice. I fled through the door that the dead man was pointing to, and I found myself back in the version of the manager's office that I recognized. Here, the only door was the one that I had just walked through, and when I opened it for a second time, I was back in Pop's grocery. The corpse and infinite rooms were gone, but that weird list was still in my hand. I asked Irene to cover for me and I headed for the sheriff's office. I was lucky that Sheriff Benjamin Lloyd was in his office and not in a squad car waiting to pull me over. I was so disturbed by what I had seen that I made the 20-minute drive across town in less than 10. The office was quiet, and Sheriff Lloyd called me into his office right away. "Yeah, I recognize some of these names," he grunted, twirling his mustache as he read through the list that I had presented to him. He seemed nervous, but I wasn't sure why. Linda Newsom, for instance. She tried to chew the postman's face off back in '07. What? She tried to eat someone. Yep, happened in your store too. The sheriff eyed me suspiciously, as though this was somehow my fault. She came running out of the automotive section and started biting this poor fella. When we were able to finally drag her off of him, she was screaming about how she had been lost in the store for weeks and how she was so hungry. I shivered. Linda's story sounded too familiar for comfort. "Do you have any idea why my grandfather's name would be on this list? He went missing in a fishing accident." "Well, I mean, that's what we figured. We found his truck in the store lot. Plenty of people parked there and dragged their canoes to the creek across the road." "The store lot? You mean Pop's?" I couldn't believe it. "Course. Back then, Pop's was the only store there was." "So let me get this straight." I took a deep breath. You've got a bunch of disappearances and murders and weird events that all happen in the same place, and no one has done anything about it." Sheriff Lloyd reclined in his chair with a mean glint in his eye, like he was sizing me up for an orange jumpsuit. "I'm not sure I like what you're implying here, son. We're talking about very different crimes. Look, if you take a 60-year history of any place, you're bound to find some unexplained deaths and odd happenings. It's around us all the time. We just don't pay any attention to it." The sheriff got to his feet and opened his office door. "I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help, but I need to get back to work." "So there won't be an investigation?" I demanded. "There already was an investigation," Lloyd sneered. "Back when I was a deputy. My predecessor, Sheriff Paulson, led it personally." "Your predecessor? Could I speak with him then?" "Sure you can if you can find him." Lloyd handed the list back to me, his finger hovering over the final name. James Paulson. I drew some strange looks from the customers as I skidded into the reserved-for-manager parking spot at Pop's Grocery, leapt from the car like a drunk and ran straight for Irene. I found her beside one of the new automated cash registers that I had installed. The machine had swallowed a customer's money and was making a hellish whirring sound until Irene had smacked it expertly. The machine made a sad robotic beep and spat out a 20. Satisfied, she turned to me. "You knew," I snapped, careless of the people around. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Well, I used to tell lots of people about what goes on around here, and then some of them disappeared, and I stopped talking so much." She eyed me coolly. "The more you notice this place, the more it notices you." I looked helplessly around at the freshly painted aisles, the bright shelves brimming with the new organic produce that I had ordered, the employees chatting while on break. This place had been my dream, my investment, my hope for the future. What would I do if it failed? I had no idea. I hung my head. "You want my advice?" Irene clapped me on the shoulder. "Forget about it. Stay where it's bright and crowded, ignore anything unusual, and get paid at the end of the month and get on with your life. That's what I do, and 40 years later I'm still here." "But what about my grandfather? What about Frank Kelch, Sheriff Paulson, and who knows how many others?" "What about them?" Irene sighed. "Look, I like you, kid. You've done a lot of good for this place, and I would hate to see you throw it all away the way those three did." I nodded, but inside I was reeling. "Those three," Irene had said. Was my grandfather investigating Pop's Grocery when he had disappeared, like the others were? Grandpa Eddie Lee had been a tough man, an ex-factory machinist whose thoughts didn't go much deeper than the trivia on the bottom of a beer coaster, or so I had always thought. After work, I stayed up past midnight going through my grandfather's old things. I found something that I never would have imagined in a hollowed-out Louis L'Amour novel. My grandfather had kept a diary. It chronicled Frank Kelch's discovery of the nightmare inside his store, Sheriff Paulson's investigation, and the three men's attempts to explore the strangeness that they had uncovered. It was full of sketches, expedition-style supply lists, handmade maps, and detailed directions for navigating the surreal labyrinth on the other side of Pop's Grocery. The last entry had been made just 2 days before my grandfather had disappeared, and I decided to start there. I knew that there was no way I could sleep after what I had read, and besides, according to my grandfather's diary, the hungry place inside of Pop's was most active at night. I loaded up a backpack with everything the diary suggested: spare water and food, light sources, warm clothing, fishing wire, and I headed back to Pop's. I felt a little silly walking around a grocery store with enough gear for a caving expedition, but soon enough I was glad that I had it. The changes began just as they had before, with the unsettling sensation that the aisle I was walking down had gotten just a bit longer than I remembered. I tied the first roll of fishing wire to the end cap, and when I turned, I experienced that stomach-churning sensation for the second time. The checkered tile floor was stretching out in front of me, extending like a cartoon carpet. The roll of fishing wire whirred and then finally came to a halt. I looked forward and then backward. There was no end to the aisle in which I stood. I hitched the backpack a little higher, hoping that the rattle of the food and water inside would calm my nerves, but it had the opposite effect. My supplies were limited, but the hungry place apparently wasn't. Did it even have an end? And by the time I found it, would I come out raving mad and hungry for anything, even human flesh? I had been worried that there would be monsters in this hellish other side of Pop's supermarket, but as I trudged down the infinite aisle, I realized that I had been mistaken. I had brought the monsters in with me. I clung to the fishing wire like a child clinging to a magical rabbit's foot, repeating to myself again and again that as long as I held it, I was safe. The further that I walked, however, the more I began to have my doubts. The new lamps that I had installed were retreating upwards and away, like stars expanding into an empty, lightless universe. Before long, they were just pinpricks in the dark, and then, not even that, I turned on my headlamp and realized that I could see my breath. I chanced to look at the products on the shelves beside me. At first, they appeared to have been altered in the same way as before. The labels misspelled, the products inside charcoal gray and strange. Now, however, they were hard to look at, bent, rotten, and wrong. Whatever change was affecting them, it was stronger in the dark. They reached out for me as I passed, as though attracted by the warmth of my blood. The black spots covering them might have been mold, or maybe clusters of eyes. I forced myself to look at the tile floor and keep walking, and walking and walking. The first roll of 3,000-meter fishing wire ran out, so did the second. While I was attaching the third to an aisle end cap, the thing on the shelf above me began to move. They were no longer simply squirming and squelching. They were actively trying to attack me. Black writhing shapes wrapped in plastic and cardboard launched themselves off the shelves to splatter on the checkered tile floor. I could hear slithering in the dark. The splattering became as loud as a heavy rainfall. There were thousands of them. I lost it. I started running. The backpack hammered against my back. Sweat poured down my forehead, but the sound was fading out. Whatever was back there, I had left it behind for now. Something new was ahead of me, a wall of glass-doored refrigerators. I focused the beam of my headlamp left and then right. There was no end to them in either direction, apart from a metal door that I recognized. It led to Pop's, a cold storage area. I took a step and then I felt a tug. Another roll of fishing wire had run out. My throat was dry. I had an insane urge to shout, "Anyone home?" into the abyss just to break the awful silence of the place. But I knew that making a sound here would be death. I couldn't see what was on the other side of the clouded, freezer-burnt refrigerator doors, and I was pretty sure that I didn't want to. Holding my breath, I tied my second-to-last roll of fishing wire to the handle of the metal door and I stepped inside. There could be no doubt about it. I was in another world now. As far as I knew, I had gone deeper into this bizarre other world that existed inside of Pop's grocery than anybody had before. I had discovered an end to these supposedly endless aisles, a wall of freezer-burned refrigerators with 2 rusted double doors in the middle, doors which in my reality led to the cold storage area. As I stepped through them, some instinct screamed that I was making a mistake, that it was my last chance to turn back. I ignored it. I had come this far, and who could say if I would ever be back here again? When I didn't hear any doors close behind me, I knew that something was wrong. The employees at Pop's were constantly complaining about how the doors swung shut with a vengeance, always smashing the foot or shoulder of whoever was pushing a pallet through to the other side. But the moment that I stepped through, it was like the whole place that I had left behind had ceased to exist. The doors, the refrigerators, the endless aisles, they were all gone. The fishing wire went limp in my hands. A bare concrete floor stretched on as far as the light of my headlamp could reach. The space was dark and freezing. My employees and I usually put on an extra layer when we worked in cold storage, but the temperatures here were so low that my teeth were chattering. I put on the heavier clothes that I had brought in my backpack. My grandfather had been right on the expedition. Quality gear was needed while exploring, wherever this was. I started walking forward, or at least in the direction that I thought was forward. The emptiness of the space was starting to get to me. The cold was too. I just needed to see some kind of landmark, some sign that the darkness that I was trapped in didn't just go on forever. I almost fell down the stairs. They were the same ugly gray color as the concrete floor, almost like they had been made to blend in on purpose. By who or what, I couldn't imagine, but this was a first. There were no stairs in the cold storage area of Pop's, and none had been mentioned in my grandfather's journal either. Was this where it all ended? Had Frank Couch, Sheriff Paulson, and my grandfather all reached this point, to never come back from what lay beyond it? There was only one way that I could find out. I pulled my knit cap a little tighter over my ears and I started down the stairs. The air got colder and hazier the further that I went, filled with tiny floating particles like dust. I was just beginning to wonder what they were and whether breathing them in might be dangerous, when a white-hot burst of pain exploded in my skin. I tumbled forward, crashing into a wall that signaled the end of the stairs. My blood turned to ice when I realized what I had tripped over. It was another fishing wire. Somebody had been here before. I got to my feet, brushing clouds of blackish-gray dust from my clothing. To the right was an eerily ordinary door that read "Manager." It probably led back to the maze of offices that I knew so well. Wary of awakening whatever was on the other side, I looked left, where the fishing wire led down a tangled corridor of cords, tubes, and rusted pipes. Each time the corridor branched in a new direction, I followed the fishing wire. I knew that it was foolish to believe that whoever had placed the wire knew the way out of here, but it was the only hope that I had. Frayed electrical wires hung down like cobwebs from the low ceiling. Pipes jutted out into the narrow passage like vines in some bizarre industrial jungle. Just as I was stepping over one, I heard an uncannily familiar sound up ahead, a roll of fishing wire unraveling. I rushed around the corner up ahead, eager to meet whoever was exploring this place with me. I should have known. I got lucky. The shotgun blast deafened me, but missed taking off my face by just a few inches. Shrapnel from the wall sliced into my cheeks as I instinctively hit the floor, hands over my head. "Don't shoot!" I screamed at the short, stocky figure standing at the far end of the hallway. He had a yellowed miner's flashlight taped to a shotgun and wore gear that looked like Korean war kit from some army surplus store. I rolled backwards as he fired a second time. "Liar," a hoarse voice roared. "You won't fool me, you beast. Die." More deafening shots blasted the wall. A few of the pipes began leaking a murky reddish liquid that steamed as it oozed out of them. But I had bigger problems. The crazed explorer was charging me. All I could do was run, following the most convoluted path, in the hopes that my pursuer wouldn't be able to get a clear shot. As I sprinted away from the deranged, howling voice behind me, the corridors became stranger. The walls and floor were no longer entirely concrete and wire. Parts of them were uncomfortably spongy and warm to the touch. The branching pipes took on organic shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of human veins. "Liar, face stealer, what did you do with Eddie?" "Eddie? Edgar Lee, my grandfather." Another shot hit the wall in front of me. This time, an awful moan reverberated through the corridor. I couldn't shake the feeling that this part of Pops was alive somehow, and that we were making it angry. The ragged wires hanging from the ceiling now seemed more like hair. The floor became uneven and bone-like. I had to act. Crouching behind a sharp corner, I took off my backpack. When my pursuer came charging past, I swung it into his face as hard as I could. The big man went down, but he kept his grip on the shotgun. I coiled myself around it, fighting to pry it from his grasp as he fired twice more into the ceiling of the corridor. By the time that I wrangled it away from him, it was out of ammunition, and more of that murky red goo was dripping from the ceiling above him. I looked down at the now empty shotgun. Paulson read the name engraved into the stock. "I'm not a monster," I shouted. "I'm Edgar Lee's grandson." That's impossible. It seemed to take Sheriff Paulson a moment to realize how absurd it was to think that anything was impossible in a place like this. "It got to Eddie. He's a part of it now. My God, how long have I been in here?" Sheriff Paulson looked to be in his early 60s, probably the age that he was when he, Frank Couch, and my grandfather began exploring the place. But I wasn't concerned about that then. I was more worried about the ragged mass of black tendrils hanging down from the ceiling above Paulson, from the hole that he had created by firing so wildly with the shotgun. I had thought that it was my imagination at first, but those wires or hairs or whatever they were had begun to stretch downward toward the heavy-set old man on the floor. Before I could shout a warning, they had coiled around him, lifting him toward the black fissure in the ceiling. "You won't take me, no, you won't take me." He flailed his arms wildly, but it was too late. The ragged, reddish stuff that the ceiling was made of chomped down on Paulson again and again until nothing was left of him, apart from a single blood-splattered boot, which tumbled to the ground at my feet. The tendrils were inching toward me now, and I had no intention of being consumed as Paulson had. I sprinted forward, flinging even deeper into the maze of tunnels. I came here looking for answers about what had happened to my grandfather, but now that I had begun to find them, was I really sure that I wanted to know? Maybe I should have been paying more attention to what I had ahead of me, instead of the nightmare that I had left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about Sheriff Paulson, how he looked as though he had only disappeared a few days ago, even though almost 30 years had passed since he had gone missing. I couldn't stop thinking about the vein-like tendrils that had emerged from the wall to consume him. I couldn't stop thinking about this place, or part of it. Anyway, it was somehow alive. The sweat streamed down my forehead, my shirt was already soaked. The air had gotten warmer, thicker somehow, and it felt like no matter how heavily I breathed, it just wasn't enough. It was impossible to tell whether the pipes and wires that I was dodging were organic or mechanical, but it was clear that pretty soon the path would be too tangled to move forward. I glanced left and right, but the other passages looked even narrower. I took another deep breath that felt far too shallow. It was time to consider turning back. As I turned around, however, I realized that going back was no longer an option. The gruesome tubes that lined the walls were rearranging themselves, creating a flesh-colored web to block my path. I had a knife to hack through them with in my pack, which I had lost in the fight with Sheriff Paulson and his shotgun. I stopped moving and I forced myself to think. When I had come across the staircase a few hours before, all of my thoughts had been focused on finding some kind of structure that led to somewhere else. Likewise, Sheriff Paulson had clearly felt trapped and threatened by his surroundings. Could it be that the place was feeding off my fear, my claustrophobia? If I could concentrate my thoughts on something else. An image flashed through my head. My grandfather holding my hand while we walked through the aisles of pubs. We had just been fishing on a humid summer morning and I was starving. And Grandpa Eddie was telling me that we could split a carton of ice cream that I wanted, so long as I didn't tell Mom. I fixated on that memory as I moved forward, recoiling at the touch of the sticky touch of these strands that blocked my path. It wasn't enough. Maybe I just couldn't keep my mind off of the slowly constricting tunnel around me. Maybe I had been wrong all along and my fears and fantasies played no role at all in shaping the impossible space around me. Once it swallowed me up, just like it had swallowed Sheriff Paulson and Grandpa Eddie, and who knew how many others. None of it would matter anyway. The strands were too thick to push through now, and with every passing second, the tunnel became just a tiny bit tighter. It was going to crush me to death. I shut my eyes and accepted my fate. If I was going to die, at least I wanted to do it with a beautiful thought in mind. A summer day fishing with Grandpa Eddie, ice cream, any flavor that I wanted. I gave one final push and the wall gave way. As constricting as it was, it had only been a thin membrane, one which resealed itself the moment that I was through. I was back in the freezer aisle. Something squirmed in the distance where before the endless rows of refrigerators had disappeared into darkness. There was a wall there right now, but it was moving. I tensed up, ready for anything, except for what appeared. An eye opened in the wall. It was grotesquely large, over 5 times my own size, yet I recognized it. It was my grandfather's. It watched me for a long moment, its expression unreadable, and then vanished. I was too stunned to move until I realized what the appearance of the wall meant. There might be an end to this place after all. If I could focus all my thoughts on the store, not on escape, not on terror, just on walking through its aisles one more time. Beeping. I had spent so long on the other side that at first I didn't recognize the sound of the automatic checkout. An old woman in the dairy section dropped the block of cheese that she was holding as I passed, and she wasn't the only one who was staring. I realized how I must look. Filthy, bruised, and bleeding, with a 2-day growth of beard on my face and terror in my eyes. I could hear casual conversations and music playing softly from the speakers. The products on the shelves, the overhead lights, the length of the aisles, they were all normal, safe. Or so I thought. Was there really any way to know whether I had actually returned to where I had come from? or whether I was just lost in yet another pocket dimension inside of Pop's grocery. I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't. All I can do is stick to the plan and try to live my life as best as I can. After I cleaned myself up in the bathroom, I went to the manager's office and wrote a brief speech with the door open, of course. In it, I outlined the importance of not being alone in Pop's grocery, of leaving doors open, of staying focused on reality when fear began to change it. All of the lessons I had learned during my 3 nearly fatal explorations. The younger employees rolled their eyes when I announced the new store policies, but Irene nodded approvingly. The subtle warnings she had tried to give her coworkers over the years were finally being made official. I hoped it would be enough. Until now, those instructions to my employees were the closest that I came to telling anyone about what I underwent on the other side of Pop's grocery. I'm still not sure whether telling my story is the right thing to do. I can't shake the feeling that the forces present in places like Pop's are sentient somehow. Maybe it wants the store to be successful, to increase its chances of catching prey. Maybe it let me go knowing that I would share my experience, potentially luring in other foolish explorers. Well, that's a chance that I'll have to take. I need the world to know that the hungry places exist. I need people to be aware that there are worlds hidden beneath the surface of this one, worlds that thrive on fear and pain. And that, if you're not careful, you can get lost in them forever. Okay, so this thing started a few months ago. For a bit of context, while I do live in a fairly big city, the neighborhood that I live in is quite small and close-knit, so everybody knows each other. My local corner store is owned by a middle-aged couple. It's a pretty sad-looking small place, but it does good business and it's conveniently close to a lot of people. The couple run the counter themselves in shifts of 7 hours from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. That was until about 6 months ago, when the store began operating at 24 hours a day, with someone else taking the night shifts. Now, I didn't actually know this was even a thing until a few weeks ago. Being a digital artist, I work from home and I'm on my own schedule, so I'll go days without interacting with people at a time when I'm busy working on a project. I usually work at night too, as the silence helps me concentrate. It was during one of those sleepless nights of staring at a bright monitor, as it burns my eyes, that I found out that I ran out of soda, which was a big no. So I got dressed up, went down the stairwell to my apartment building, and I went to get more. Being about 2 in the morning, I thought that my local store was closed up, so I was going to take a 15-minute walk through the chilly night breeze to get another one that's open 24/7. That was until I walked past it and saw that the lights were still turned on, the sign on the front door reading, "Open." Guess this is a thing, huh? I thought to myself as I changed directions and I walked into the store. Like I said, since this is a small neighborhood, I expected the guy at the counter to be someone from around here, or perhaps one of the owner's older sons. That's why I was surprised to find the man slouching over the counter was a complete stranger that I had never seen before. The employee badge on his clearly not fitting checkered shirt reading Jeremy. The first thing I noticed about this Jeremy guy was that he was huge, having to bend over at what seemed to be an awkward angle to rest his elbows on a counter that comes up to my chest. Medium length, greasy black hair falling over his face and covering his eyes completely. It made sense to me at the time that they would hire such a big guy to work the counter during the night shift, so I didn't think about it at all. With him not reacting to me entering, I simply grabbed myself a medium bottle of Coke and then placed it on the counter next to his arms, which were long and lanky and, being closer now, noticeably pale. I pulled out a $10 bill and placed it on the counter, to which he gave me this weird nod, as to say that he had acknowledged my presence. I looked at him for a few moments, the sound of his heavy breathing and the fan being the only noises. The change?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Huh?" Jeremy sort of asked, sort of grunted in a deep, guttural way. "You've got to give me the change, man," I told him, just as confused at his behavior, thinking this guy must be very new to this. "Oh, the change, right. Jeremy responded, speaking in a weirdly stilted manner, like he simply sounded the words out rather than talked them. He turned his head toward the cash register, and this is when I realized something was seriously wrong, and I seriously wished that I just had never noticed it. Up until this point, I would have chalked up his behavior to him just being some antisocial weirdo. But the way that his hand just snapped into place from the counter to the cash register, that was not how humans move. His arm didn't move from left to right naturally. Rather, it just jerked violently like a bear trap closing. So fast if I hadn't looked at his arm when he did, that I wouldn't even have noticed it happening. As his large hand fumbled clumsily in the register, my mind began to slowly register what I had just seen. Sweat droplets began forming on my brow as my breathing became just as heavy as his, while I waited until finally he got the money out and placed it haphazardly on the counter. "Thanks, have a good one," I managed to say quickly as I picked up the change and the soda. He just did that awkward nod again in response. As I walked out of the door, I looked back one more time, expecting to see. I don't know what I was expecting, but Jeremy was just standing there as before, slouched over the counter, his body only moving from the deep breathing that he took. I walked fast all the way back home, almost sprinting up the staircase of my apartment building, and then once inside, locking the door instantly. I put the soda on my desk, cursing myself for going out to get it, and then sat down on my office chair to catch my breath, thinking about what had just happened. What the heck was that? I mumbled to myself, wiping the sweat from my brow. I looked out the window at the store across the street from me. Still open, lights still on. I looked back at the soda, trying to confirm to myself that I didn't just imagine that encounter. There was no way that I could get back to work after that. I just sat absent-mindedly on the computer for a few more hours. I glanced out the window every 20 minutes or so, seeing customers going in and out from time to time. I just went to sleep at about 4 a.m., trying to take my mind off of it. Of course, the next day when I woke up at noon, it was still fresh on my mind. The feeling of dread didn't go away the entire day either, but I just pretended like it didn't bother me. I tried going back to work that night, drowning out my thoughts with it. If I just didn't think about it, then it couldn't affect my life. I could just go back to normal, pretend that it never happened. After all, I could have just been seeing things from lack of sleep the night before. But no matter how much I tried to forget it, the vivid memory of his arm moving akin to a praying mantis, it just wouldn't go away. I couldn't work or sleep soundly anymore, missing out on several commissions because of this. Dread not leaving me. I had to know what was up with this guy. On another sleepless night, I decided to look out the window and see if Jeremy, or whatever this thing was, would come out when his shift ended. This would confirm that I had just imagined the whole thing. At around 7:45 a.m., Jeremy awkwardly walked out the front doors and locked them. My heart was beating so hard as I watched him do the same violent snappy motions as before. After he locked the doors, he just stumbled down the street until he was out of sight. Well, not stumbled. His body simply moved erratically, the top of his body jerking up and down as his legs carried him forward. It was like watching a marionette move. After a while, one of the owners, the husband, showed up and started his shift, and I just slumped back into my office chair, head in my hands. Seeing that made the situation even worse. I just wanted to throw up after seeing that, but I had to compose myself. I wasn't crazy, I knew that much. So therefore, there had to be a logical answer to this. That's just how the world works. I would find out just what is wrong with this guy and then my life would go back to normal. And maybe this would make for a funny story to tell in the future. But I had to find out first. 2 days later, on another sleepless night, I had enough. I got dressed up, went down the stairs of my apartment building, went outside, and then got behind some bushes across the street from the store. And then I just watched Jeremy through the front doors. The nervousness that I felt just turned into plain unease as he just stood there, slouched over the counter like the first time that I saw him. He wasn't watching the TV. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't even sitting down. Just standing there looking at absolutely nothing. You might have thought that he was just sleeping while standing up, if it wasn't for the occasional wheezes and coughs that caused his body to shake. As strange and unsettling as that was, he wasn't doing anything incriminatory or well inhuman. As the night went on, there was nothing out of the ordinary. He interacted with a few customers and even got up to sweep the floors 2 times, but in that same broken movement. It didn't make any sense. If this guy was actually a monster, what did he have to gain out of working a menial job? Why would he keep the facade up when no one was looking? Eventually, at 7:45 a.m., he just locked the shop and left, like he had 2 nights ago when I had watched him. I didn't follow him, and I just went back home to think that it was over. As I sat in my office chair once again, I thought that maybe I really was overreacting. I thought that maybe the guy was just handicapped and that I was being mean for stalking him and making up these wild theories in my head. After all, none of the other customers seemed to notice that there was something wrong with them, or be bothered by it. I wanted to believe that, and in hindsight, I should have just believed that. But instead I decided that I was going to ask about him to just find out anything. I woke up at noon the next day and I went to the store. One of the owners, the husband, was sitting outside and smoking, while the wife had worked the register. He looked up at me and nodded with a smile on his face as I approached him. "Hey man, long time no see." He greeted me and we shook hands. "You want to smoke?" He asked, but I waved it off. "I know, right?" I asked sarcastically. "I've been busy with some projects, so I've only been up at night the past week or so," I said, hoping that he brings up the new schedule of the store. His eyes brightened up a bit. "Oh, you didn't know? We're open at night now too, so if you need anything you can come by," he said before putting the cigarette back in his mouth to take in another breath. "Huh, really now? You're working the counter at nights too?" I asked dryly, knowing the answer already. "Oh nah, I hired this one kid, his name's Jeremy. You don't know him, he's from another part of town," he explained, waving the cigarette in his hand as he talked, leaving trails of smoke. "Really?" I asked incredulously, as he nodded and I leaned back against the wall to make myself comfortable. We made some small talk afterwards. I wasn't really listening to any of it though. I was just trying to make it look like a casual conversation. So what about this Jeremy kid? What am I in for when I meet him?" I asked a bit out of nowhere. He seemed surprised by the question, but then relaxed again and puffed out some more smoke. "Now I don't know him very well. I haven't spoken to him much since I had hired him, but he's all polite and friendly, and he has a good sense of humor too. Very dark though. I think you'll like the guy," he explained. Well, that certainly sounded different from the Jeremy that I met. "A dark sense of humor?" I asked, intrigued. "Yeah," he laughed. "You couldn't even tell by looking at the guy with his bright face and slicked back hair. He just looks too friendly," he explained. Now I knew something was wrong for sure, and I instantly felt a pit in my stomach. "The slicked back hair, huh?" I just repeated back absentmindedly. He nodded and laughed. There was some more small talk after that, but I couldn't possibly listen to any of it. I went right back home after that feeling sick. The puzzle was finally coming together, but it was forming into an image that I didn't want. I had approached this entire issue from the wrong angle. There was nothing wrong with Jeremy because, well, this wasn't Jeremy. It was something pretending to be him, and the thought alone made my skin crawl. I just had to know. I shouldn't have looked into it any further, but I just had to know. One last stakeout to see for sure. And so the next night, I was once again in the bushes across the street from the store. A few hours went by, and once again, Jeremy locked up the store and left. This time, I was going to follow him to see where he ended up at. Following him was incredibly easy. He had absolutely no awareness of anything around him. He nearly walked into a lamppost at one point. I was, of course, still a bit freaked out by his behavior and the quietness of the streets, but I was also filled with a bit of hatred inside of me. Hatred for this guy for making me this scared. That motivated me to follow him. Only a few streets away from the store, he unexpectedly just turned into a dark alley. I watched him as he turned his back to a wall, and then his arms just suddenly bent backwards at the elbows and grabbed onto the brick wall behind him. And then just as fast as that, he started climbing up the wall like that, his limbs moving like that of a spider, until he finally reached the top of the building and I lost sight of him. I didn't quite know how to react, to be honest. I mean, how would you? I don't remember the walk home either. The dread only really settled in back home, as I was sitting on my bed, thinking about what I had just seen. There was no going back to ignorance now. I tried going back to not thinking about it again, feeling like the more that I uncovered about this, the more that I would regret it. What followed were a few more restless nights. Missed out on so much work, but I didn't really care. I refused to even look out the window anymore. I had to put an end to this stupid stuff. I couldn't allow it to take over my life like this. And to take my mind off of it, I decided to go over to my girlfriend Sarah's house, who I hadn't spoken to since this entire thing had started. I had neglected my entire life over something so stupid. When she opened the door to her apartment and saw me, she seemed pretty upset. "Oh, you're still alive, huh?" she asked in a sarcastic voice. "Listen, I'm sorry," I started. "I've been going through a lot lately, but I shouldn't have neglected you. I just need someone, okay?" I said in what must have sounded like a pretty pathetic plea. She sighed at this. "Fine, come in and tell me about it," she said, waving me inside. I sat down on her couch and started talking, but I didn't tell her about it. Instead, I just made up some crap about how I was depressed and stressed without mentioning the store clerk, or rather the thing pretending to be one. Despite her initial annoyance, she was pretty supportive and happy that I had talked to her about it. Told her that I wanted to stay at her place for a while and she accepted. Things were okay for about a week after that. I relaxed for a bit and started sleeping again. But I didn't entirely forget about it. But I didn't think about it as nearly as much. I think Sarah's presence helped me as well, being supportive of me. Of course, the normalcy that I had found again didn't last for long though. I was watching the TV, a baseball game I think, when something caught my attention. In the first few rows, there was a guy sitting slouched over, hair over his face. My heart sank and I had to do a double take. But it was real. Every time the camera showed that section of the stands, he was still there. Jeremy? I thought to myself at first, but this wasn't him. The camera was far away and he was hard to make out, but I could see that he had brown hair that was shorter. The camera caught him getting up to leave as the match had ended, but there it was, the same broken movement that Jeremy had. I looked around me for a bit after that, thinking that I had imagined it. How was it possible? There couldn't be more of these things, right? "What are you thinking about so seriously?" asked Sarah, placing her hands on my shoulders. "Well, you know," I said and then just shrugged. When she said that, I swear that I heard something in her voice. For only a split second, I could swear that something slipped in her speech that reminded me of how Jeremy sounded up his words. I squashed the thought. I was only being paranoid. While I could have simply chosen to believe that I had imagined what I saw on television, and tack even the entire thing, I couldn't lie to myself. I decided to do what most people do when they have a question. I looked it up online on an old laptop that I had brought to her apartment. Eventually, after browsing through several different sub-forums and paranormal websites, I found one that looked like what I was after. It was just about skin-stealing creatures in particular, nothing specific. Of course, most posts looked like they had been made by people that were insane, talking about how their family members or known ones had been replaced, government conspiracies, reptilians, basically every cliche that is associated with the types of people that post on forums like this. I did make an account, however, and I posted only one thread with the title, "Did anybody see the baseball game last night?" I didn't leave any other details. If someone did watch it and saw the same thing as me, it would confirm it. Half an hour later, I had only gotten 2 replies from people that were telling me that I was probably on the wrong forum, so I decided to check back later. That whole experience made me even more paranoid. One thread that I read in particular had caused it. The users in that one thread were talking about these skin-stealing things, and how they theorized that while younger ones would be easier to spot, the ones that had been in human skins longer could become indistinguishable from real humans. Now there was nothing that could back up that theory, or back anything up on that website, as it was filled with insane conspiracy theorists, but it did unsettle me to think about it. "Hey Sarah," I asked from across the apartment, "when's my birthday?" "Your birthday?" She shouted back a bit confused, before thinking for a second. "It's on the 25th of May, why?" she continued, walking into the room with me. I shrugged my shoulders in response. Although my back was turned to her, I could feel this cold, burning hatred in her look. I thought that I was imagining it, but I felt so uncomfortable that I turned around to face her. But when I looked at her face, she seemed normal, smiling even. More paranoia, maybe. The next morning, I was out at a cafe to clear up my mind. I couldn't let the paranoia get to me, and that's all this entire thing was. It had to be. As I was sitting down to drink my coffee and think things over again, out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn that I saw one of the waitress's hands do the exact same snapping motion as she handed a plate of coffee cups to someone. Nearly choking on my coffee, I turned my head to look at her, and she noticed me and looked back and gave me a weird knowing smile, before going back to whatever she was doing. Did she know what I saw? Did I even see it, or was my mind playing tricks on me? A familiar sickness came over me again, so I just paid for my coffee and left without finishing it. As I walked back home, I just couldn't shake that sick feeling. It had to be paranoid because I felt like every person was looking at me. That stupid forum messed with my mind so much. It made sense though, right? That once they wore the skins of a human enough, they would be able to learn and pretend to be human. It made sense in my mind, at least. I got home, and as I opened the door, Sarah was just standing there. It took her 2 seconds to greet me. Is there something wrong?" she asked, moving out of the way to let me inside. "Well, you know, it's whatever," I said, shrugging and pretending to be cool. She seemed concerned but didn't say anything. I went to the bathroom and washed my face a couple of times to cool down. I looked at myself in the mirror for a while afterwards. I wasn't losing my mind, was I? If you had asked me a week ago if I really saw Jeremy climb up that building, I would tell you that I did see it without a doubt. But now I wasn't so sure. Was I having a psychotic break? Later that evening, I went back to that forum to see if I got any other replies, though by that point I was planning to just try and forget about the entire thing again. As I should have expected by then, the thread was deleted by a moderator for being off topic. I was going to delete my account and forget about it, but then I noticed a private message. It was from a user called Mr. White Rabbit 87. I checked out his profile. The account was 10 years old with no posts. The message read, I saw your post. Meet me at the Sigil Bar tomorrow at 9 a.m. Delete message after you read it. What the heck? I muttered to myself under my breath after reading that. It was probably some lunatic knowing that website. But it did say it wanted to meet in a public place. However, there was a little danger there. I decided to do as it asked, out of curiosity, and I deleted the message. I barely slept that night, as tired as I was mentally. I couldn't stop thinking about who wanted to meet me. I got a cold shiver when, for a second, I considered that it could have been one of those things trying to trap me. I tried squashing the thought, but the sound of my girlfriend's breathing, it unnerved me even further. Where are you going? Sarah asked me, rubbing her eyes as I got out of bed and began dressing early in the morning. Oh, I'm meeting a friend, I replied rather coldly as I got ready to move. At a bar or something? She asked, raising an eyebrow jokingly. That took me off guard. What? I asked, and she must have sensed that it bothered me since her smile faded. I'm just asking. Is there anything wrong? She continued. I shrugged my shoulders and then laughed. She must have read the message. Now it could have just been a lucky guess, but something inside of me told me that it wasn't. What was she doing looking through my account on such an obscure website? I began sweating nervously as I made my way to the bar, deciding that it would have to wait for later. I got to the Sigil Bar at around 8:45, sat down at a table in the back and ordered a beer for myself, though I didn't touch it. Only about 10 minutes later, a man that appeared to be in his 40s with short brown hair, stubble on his face that wore sunglasses indoors, walked up from behind me. He looked at me and then nodded and then sat down at the opposite end of the table from me. I'm Mr. Grayson, pleased to meet you, he said, extending his hand out to me, which I shook. I know who you are, I saw your post. He continued in a low, deep tone, his voice like that of a chain smoker. Then who are you? I asked him. He put up a hand to stop my questions and he turned around at the red-haired waitress, with bangs who I always thought had a weird look with that haircut. Hey, can I get a mug of beer? He asked her. Whatever works, I'm not going to finish it anyway. He waited until he got his mug and then he took a long, loud sip out of it, before sighing and looking back at me. I wasn't exactly impatient at this point. The entire experience was weird enough to not be boring as much as unsettling. So, who are you? I asked Mr. Grayson again. I'm with the government, kid. He explained before reaching into his coat for his cigarette, and then putting it back in, realizing that it's a bar with a no smoking rule. What branch? I asked him. What? He asked back, confused. Which branch of the government do you work for? I asked again, this time louder and clearer. Listen, kid, do you think I'm gonna expose a branch of the government that shouldn't even exist to some random guy this casually? He replied, smiling slyly. Are you gonna kill me or something? I asked jokingly. He chuckled dryly. Would I sit down to have a beer with you if I wanted to kill you? Seems like kind of a waste of time, he smiled. There was a bit more awkward silence after that. He drank some more beer and I wanted to take a sip of mine too, but I decided against it. It was like neither of us wanted to start talking about the subject. So, I started. What about the baseball game? I asked a bit more quietly. He sighed. Well, I know those things exist, if that's what you're asking me. You're not crazy, he explained to me. And what does the government plan to do anything about it? I asked more aggressively. Once again, he put out his hand for me to relax. That's why I'm here. We've been trying to He started, scratching his chin. About 20 years ago, I got assigned to this case about 10 years ago myself. This situation is more complex than you can think. Can you at least tell me what the heck these things are then? I asked him, calmer this time. He pursed his lips before leaning slightly forward. We've believe that what we're dealing with here is a species of parasite-like creatures that cannot live in their own bodies and require the skins of humans to survive. He explained with no humor in his voice. Believe? I asked incredulously. Yeah, believe. We haven't exactly been able to catch one yet. These things are hard to find as it is. We've theorized that they make up less than 1% of the world's population, and we only got random anonymous reports to go by when hunting them. He explained again. For some reason, a considerable amount of the reports come from this city. So, are they like skinwalkers then? I asked, trying to relate it to a concept that I'm familiar with. He pursed his lips. Similar, but not quite. Unlike skinwalkers, these aren't spirits. The skin stealing in this sense is literal. It's why they seem so misshapen trying to act like humans, he explained. What's their endgame? I asked, starting to feel sick again. Well, he started, sighing. It depends on who you ask. Some of the guys back at the headquarters believe that their only goal is survival. That it's simply a sort of symbiotic relationship of nature, and that we can coexist without worry, apart from a few thousand that have been killed and had their skin stolen. And the others? I asked, wanting him to go on. You can probably imagine. Conspiracy theories about world domination, replacing humanity, taking over, all that stuff, he explained. There was some more awkward silence after that as he sipped more of his beer, and I thought about what he had told me. Which one do you believe? I asked, and he smiled at me. I couldn't say this back at the headquarters, so you're listening to some top secret information right here, he said, and then leaned over the table. You know how this case has been going on for a really long time, and we have zero information on any of it. I believe that there are people within our very own government that have been replaced by those things. I'm talking about people that are very high up there. There was a lot to take in. Some random guy who could have been anybody meeting me, claiming that he's a government agent, validating what surely must have been my own mind and making things up. I mean, he had to be lying. I couldn't allow the situation to spiral out of control any further. Do you have any proof for any of this? Like that you're actually a government agent? I asked, confident. Christ, listen, kid. Right now, I could tell you anything from who actually killed Kennedy to classified records about experiments that we ran on the population back in the 60s. Point is, I don't need you to believe me. You're the one who I'm trying to help here, he explained, visibly ticked off. So no proof, I replied back smugly. He grunted before leaning over the table again. Friday night, a Saudi oil baron is going to die. He's going to be killed, but they'll say that it was an accident, he said coldly. That certainly made me drop my aura of smugness. I shook my head at what I had just heard, and I recomposed myself. Okay, so assuming you are who you say you are, why did you contact me? I asked. Because I needed to talk to someone outside of the government for help on this case. You seem like you have some history with those things, he explained, going back to his cool demeanor. So what do you want me to do? I asked. He looked at his watch before answering. Now look, I'm running a bit late here. Basically, if you want to help me, when you see one of those things again, you call me, he said, and then he slid a business card to me. Before I could say anything, he cut me off. Oh, and here's the thing. If you know for certain that it's one of those things, do not under any circumstances try to confront it. Who knows what it'll do. It was nice meeting you, he said, and then got up to leave. Wait, I said, and he turned around to see what I wanted. How do I know you're not one of those things? Ah, Christ, he sighed. You've seen those things. You would know instantly if I was one of them. And besides, he said, lowering his sunglasses to reveal two piercing blue eyes. You see, eyes are the window of the soul. That's why they cover theirs. If you don't trust me, just burn the card and never think about this again. And with that, he laughed. After he left, I sat at the bar for some 10 more minutes. I looked at the business card. thumbing it back and forward. It had his name on it with a phone number. It didn't list any workplace though. I paid for the beer that I didn't even touch, and then I went back home, feeling just all around empty inside. Sarah was cooking as I got back, and I looked her up and down. She appeared to be ever so slightly taller than I had remembered. When she turned around to look at me, I just shrugged. It couldn't be, right? The next few days after that were just a blur. I was just waiting for Friday to finally come to see if Mr. Grayson was who he actually claimed he was. Of course I already knew, but I just needed to see. Friday night, I was glued to the TV screen, waiting. It was just like he said. A very influential oil baron died. Apparently he had slipped in the bathtub and cracked his head open, though there were discrepancies about the official narrative. I think I chuckled to myself when I saw that. That beyond it confirmed it, as if I needed any more confirmation than seeing Jeremy climbing up that building with my very own eyes. I knew that I hadn't imagined any of it. I just didn't want to believe it. It was time to do something about it, however. I was going to call Mr. Grayson and tell him about Jeremy. However, "What are you laughing about?" asked Sarah from behind me. I smiled and shrugged again, and she just shook her head. "Hey, when's our anniversary?" I asked her out of nowhere. "Huh?" she asked, confused. "We met on February 3rd. Why?" "Just wanted to see if you knew," I replied, staring right into her eyes this time as I said it. She seemed confused, but then just shrugged it off. Jeremy would have to wait. There was another one closer to me. Now I know what he said about eyes being the window to the soul or whatever, but he could have been wrong about that. It's not like they ever caught one to know. The next couple of days I spent closely examining my girlfriend, watching her every move. I don't think that I got a single full night of sleep during those few days. I closely watched everything she did. I could swear that I was seeing her do movements similar to Jeremy, but I couldn't tell that if it was due to the tiredness, and it frustrated me to no end. I also kept asking her personal questions that only she would know. Her parents' name and the name of her first dog, the name of my uncle, and every time I asked it, it seemed like she got increasingly annoyed. I couldn't tell if it was because the thing thought I was onto it, or if my girlfriend was annoyed at my behavior. It was at that point that the fear that I left from these things started to turn into hatred. The months at that point of confusion and dread and lack of sleep, the paranoia that they made me feel, it was all boiling over. As I sat there on the couch staring at her and grinding my teeth in anger, as I continued to survey her movement, she turned around at me and sighed, annoyed. "What the heck is your problem?" Sarah asked. "I'm trying to be nice, but please tell me. I want to know why you're like this." "Oh, you know why," I responded, gripping the edges of the couch. "No, I don't," she replied defensively. "I want to know what your problem is so I can help you." She looked at me and I looked at her for a while. I still couldn't decide if she was actually one of those things or not, but in that moment I was almost convinced that she was. "Well?" she asked again, impatiently. I had made my choice. I was going to confront it. "I know who." I started and then stopped myself. No, I know what you are." "What?" she asked me, confused, pretending to be confused. "I know that you're not Sarah," I replied simply. "Then what the heck do you think I am?" she asked, annoyed. "You're being delusional," she said, and I didn't respond. She continued staring at me while I didn't say anything, but I was studying her face the entire time, and she, or it, seemed to do the same to me, but I just couldn't tell. "Do you think I'm an imposter?" she asked again, "like a skinwalker or something?" "Not quite," I replied, leaning back on the couch. That line, it seemed to have triggered something inside of her, and that's when I finally made up my mind. A decision that I would have to live with for the rest of my life. "Listen, I'm your girlfriend Sarah, okay?" She started, but I wasn't really listening to a word coming out of her mouth. I'm not some made-up creature or monster or whatever. I didn't reply. I just sat back on the couch. My head tilted to the side a bit as I listened to her lie to me. I think you've been listening to too many horror stories or something. Get a grip, please. She laughed nervously. I still didn't respond. Anything that she would try to tell me were just attempts at deluding me, and I knew it. Oh, come on, don't act like this, she said and reached over to grab my arm, but I recoiled it away. She sighed. Stop being absurd, I'm not going to hurt you. She looked me in the eyes again and waited for me to say something, but I remained quiet. I must have seemed pretty calm, but inside of me, the rage was building up. Every time that I heard this creature try to lie to me using my girlfriend's voice. She potted at me and rolled her eyes. Fine, believe whatever you want, she said and turned around to leave. The moment that she turned around, I got up from the couch and hit her in the back of the head, as hard as I could. As her body went limp and collapsed, I grabbed the back of her head and hit her face against the floor a few more times, to make sure that she wasn't getting up. I didn't want to give this thing a simple chance. I walked over to the kitchen, eyes on the body the entire time, and I grabbed a knife that I used to cut her throat with, black blood spilling out onto the carpeted floor. I sat back on the couch after this, and breathing heavily as I looked at the body. I had such a feeling of pride inside of me for finally doing something about it after months of torment. I hated these things so much. I stared at the body for a few minutes, and part of me almost expecting it to pop back up again, but it didn't. The adrenaline started to slowly wash away as I realized that I now had a dead body on my hands, and I needed to do something about it. It wouldn't have been far-fetched to imagine that the police were in on this too, so I had to do something about it. I grabbed my wallet and left the apartment, eyeing the body as I walked out the door. It still didn't move. After this, it turns into kind of a blur again. I returned half an hour later with a canister of gasoline that I had bought at a gas station, and I began pouring it all around the apartment. The smell was absolutely intoxicating. Afterwards, I sat in the doorway for a bit, watching the body. It still didn't move. This wasn't quite right. I set the apartment ablaze and I walked off. I was hearing fire alarms and people shouting as I walked off into the night with only my wallet and my phone. I checked the wallet and the business card that Mr. Grayson gave me, and it was still there. I didn't want to call him on my phone, so I walked a few streets until I found a public one, and I made the call there. It was pretty late, but someone did pick up. "Hello, is this Mr. Grayson?" I asked. "Yeah, that is in fact me. May I ask who I'm talking to?" He asked from the other end in that deep, raspy voice. "I'm the guy you met at a bar last week. Or was it 2 weeks ago? I don't remember anymore." I told him. "Oh, it's you, huh?" he asked. "What are you calling me so late for?" "I killed my girlfriend," I responded. There was silence after this. "What?" he asked in a quieter tone. "Yeah, I killed her and I set the apartment on fire. She's dead for sure," I explained to him. "What the heck did you do that for?" Mr. Grayson asked in a baffled tone. "Was she one of those things?" "I thought she was in the moment at least, but now I'm not really so sure," I said, realization kind of washing over me now that I was saying it out loud. "Jesus Christ. Meet me outside of the bar in like 15 minutes. We'll talk more there," he said and closed the phone. I did as he told me, and a little while later, a black car showed up and honked at me. I walked up to the driver's window to see Mr. Grayson there, still wearing his sunglasses even late at night. "Take off your sunglasses," I told him. He sighed in annoyance and lowered them so I could see his eyes. "You see, it's me, now get in," he said. Once in the car, he started driving around and I began explaining to him not just what had happened with my girlfriend, but the entire thing, and how it had all started with meeting Jeremy. "So, are you sure your girlfriend was actually one of those things?" he asked after I told him all that. "I don't know. I was sure that she was one, but now I'm like 80% sure she was. I really don't know, man," I explained to him and he nodded. "Hey, you should have called me, but it's fine," he sighed. He drove in silence for about 15 minutes before stopping in front of a cheap motel next to a red pickup truck. He pulled out his wallet and handed me $50. "Stay here until this blows over. I'll call you to update you. Try not to leave this place unless absolutely necessary," he explained. "And what are you going to do?" I asked him. "I'll look into this Jeremy guy, then we'll figure out what to do next," he told me. "And what about my girlfriend?" I asked him. He sighed heavily again. "One thing at a time. We'll figure something out, don't worry," he said. "Next time if you see one of those things, call me first, please." We shook hands and he wished me luck. I did as he asked and I booked a room for the motel. It was a miserably dirty place, but it was also incredibly cheap. I stayed there for a week and then another, not leaving at all. Those days are such a blur. I had so many thoughts and emotions running through my mind. Was that really a monster that I had killed? If so, what had happened to my real girlfriend? How many more of those things were there? Did Mr. Grayson actually have my best interests in mind? And there was barely any sleep in those weeks. I just sat there in the dark, my windows covered up. Every single tapping noise or footsteps that I had heard outside my room sent me into a panic. But one thing I remember was watching the TV a lot to hear about the incident at the apartment. I expected it to be viewed as a brutal murder and that I would be wanted by the cops. But there was absolutely nothing about it. I looked it up online too, and there wasn't a single article about it. I knew that something was wrong, well, more than it already was. My city had a low crime rate, so such a violent murder as that one, it would have surely been big news. I waited for another week, with still no news from Mr. Grayson, and still nothing on the TV. I was growing restless, so I decided to do some more investigating, as if that hadn't gotten me into so much trouble already. I walked back all the way back to our apartment building early in the morning. I expected to get some weird looks coming back there, but none of the residents seemed to pay me any mind. I walked to our apartment and the door was intact, not even any signs of soot. When I tried pushing it open, I found out that it was locked. I hadn't locked it. I thought maybe the police did. I looked around some more until I noticed a janitor was cleaning the hallway, and I decided to ask him about it. "Hey, do you know if a woman called Sarah lives here?" I asked him, pointing to the door. The man looked at me without raising the visor from his cap. "Sarah?" He asked me back and I nodded. "Oh, she's on vacation right now." "Really?" I asked him and he nodded back. Visor on his cap, still not revealing his eyes. "When did she tell you this? I hadn't heard about it." "About a month ago," he mumbled, uninterested. "Was this before or after the fire?" I asked him and this seemed to stop him in his tracks for just a second. "What fire?" he asked. There was just the slightest hint of a smirk on his face. I believe there was a common unspoken understanding between me and that thing there. I left without asking him any more questions. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried getting in contact with Mr. Grayson again, but he wouldn't pick up his phone. I even tried messaging him on that forum again, but it said that his account was deactivated. Once again, I don't really remember much of what happened during that time period. It was all a blur of negativity and confusion. I was just waiting for something to save me from this entire situation. I started watching the TV a lot more to distract myself, but that only made it worse. The thing is, once you realize these things exist, you could just start seeing them everywhere. Always somewhere in the back during a news report, lost in a crowd somewhere. I started doubting Mr. Grayson's theory that it was only 1% of the world population. How could there be so many of these things? Now most of them I couldn't confirm, but you just know for a fact that it's one of those things when you see them. And I could tell, and I knew. It was driving me insane knowing. I'd had enough and I had to get out of there. I didn't know where I would go, but I could just not be in that city anymore. Just the day that I was making preparations to leave, I got a phone call from a familiar number. "Hey kid, it's me," the raspy voice said, almost too raspy. "Listen, there's been a development in this case. I think we need to meet up to discuss what to do next." "How do you have my number? I never called you from my mobile phone," I told him. That didn't seem to cause him to even miss a beat though. "Christ, I'm with the government, kid. You think we can't figure something out like that?" he asked in an annoyed tone. I had to give this thing credit. It was doing a great Mr. Grayson impression. Of course, it was pointless because if he actually was Mr. Grayson, he would have known where I'm at. "Meet up where?" I asked, trying to play along to see what it wants. "You choose, but we have to meet today, it's important," the thing pretending to be Mr. Grayson said. "How does the center of town sound?" I asked the thing, interested to see if it was going to meet me in such an open location. "Yeah, sure, I'll drive over there right now. I'll park on Gein Street. Looking forward to seeing you, kid," it said and closed the phone abruptly. I decided to meet it. I was going to leave town afterwards, but I wanted to see what it wanted first. I should have just left right there and then, but I had to know. After so much suffering and confusion, I had to know. It was a relatively short walk. The entire time I tried to not look at many people if I could help it. I knew that I would feel sick instantly if I saw one of those things. Even then, I still felt their eyes on me. Mr. Grayson's car was parked where the thing said it would be, and the thing pretending to be him was in the car. He motioned over for me to come up to the window, which I did. "Now listen, kid," the thing started in that condescending tone that Mr. Grayson had. "I've looked into this entire thing deeper and I think you've overblown it out of proportions. That Jeremy kid that you told me about, he's not one of those things. He just has some neurological disease or something. You can go ask him yourself and see. You wasted my time with that goose chase." I didn't even respond to anything that he just said. I just stared at him, hatred seething through my body as I watched this thing blatantly lie to me. I let him continue to see what other things it would conjure up. "Your girlfriend, she's not one of those things either. She thinks that you're having some sort of mental breakdown right now, and honestly, I think I believe her. This entire thing seems to have taken a toll on you, kid. I just don't think that you're cut out for it. Just hand me back my business card and go home and forget about this entire thing," it explained as I had to try my hardest to hold back laughter. "My girlfriend is dead," I reminded the thing. Once again, it didn't miss a beat. "No, she's not. I talked to her just this morning. I can drive you to her apartment right now to meet her," it said, trying very hard to convince me of this. "How could you have talked to my girlfriend when I had killed her?" I reminded once again, but it just wouldn't accept it. "That's another thing you imagined, like the kid at the baseball game or Jeremy walking up that building, or whatever the heck you told me happened. Your girlfriend told me that you suffer from psychosis. I think that's what might have caused this entire thing," it continued lying to me. The confidence with which it had lied to me just made me hate it so much more. It would have been pointless to argue with this thing. It would have just continued claiming that I was insane. Heck, it might have even convinced me eventually. The last couple months of my life were just a blur in my mind after all. But there was one thing. While it did do an almost perfect impression of Mr. Grayson, there was one thing it couldn't actually mimic. "Take off your sunglasses," I told it. I could see the thing instantly freeze up when confronted with something that it couldn't fake. "What?" the thing asked, confused. I simply turned around and walked away from the car afterwards. I heard it calling me to come back, and when I heard the door of the car open, I started sprinting away. I walked fast all the way back to my crappy motel room to pick up some stuff before leaving town. But when I got there, I noticed a red pickup truck parked right outside of my room. There was a tall man with long, dirty blonde hair peering into my window, shoulders slouched. The tapping noises, that's what had caused it. I decided that what was in that room wasn't important anymore and turned around and left. I had to walk through the city aimlessly for a bit, Thousands of thoughts running through my mind, wondering what to do next. I had to get out of the city, but how? A bus would have been my best option. The one out of town left in a few hours. I had to kill some time, and you wouldn't believe how slow time passes when you were as stressed as I was. I didn't know how much of this was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. A burning, inhuman hatred being directed at me from several directions every time I was near a crowd of people. I didn't have the mental energy to check to see how many of those things were surrounding me at any given time. I decided to sit down on a bench on the side of the road to relax for a bit. But after a few minutes, the red pickup truck stopped right in front of me, with the same long blonde-haired guy inside of it just sitting there. I got up and sprinted away. I was so exhausted by the entire thing. After some more walking by chance, I ended up at the Sigil bar again. I figured that I might as well be somewhere inside. Even if there was more of those things there, at least the bar was dimly lit enough that I wouldn't know, and that was better. I sat there at a table near the back, catching my breath, my head in my hands. The red-haired waitress with bangs walked up to me to take my order. She returned with a mug of beer a few minutes later. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she said. I looked at her when she said that. I realized why I thought her bangs looked weird. Well, because they covered her eyes. Of course, those things knew everything. They had listened to the entire conversation me and Mr. Grayson had had about them. Who knows for how long they had been monitoring me. The thing pretending to be the waitress smiled at me. There was such a sense of a smug self-satisfaction on its face. It knew that I knew. I looked around the dimly lit room for a bit. There were about 4 or 5 of those things that I could see that had been staring at me the entire time, and I just hadn't noticed it because I was lost in my thoughts. They all knew that I knew. "Are you all right, sir?" the thing pretending to be the waitress asked. It was mocking me. These weren't just dumb parasites with an animalistic drive to survive. These were intelligent creatures that seemed to take great joy in messing with me. I had had enough. I picked up the beer mug off the table and I slammed it in the waitress's face. Shards of glass and blood flying everywhere as it shattered. It cut my hand pretty badly too, but I didn't care. I ran out of the bar as fast as I could, and then I just kept running until I eventually collapsed onto my knees on some random street. As I kneeled down on the pavement trying to catch my breath, a car pulled up right next to me. It was the red pickup truck. The thing inside just looked at me through the driver's window, not even moving. "What the heck do you want?" I shouted, getting up from the ground to walk towards it. It didn't say anything. It just continued staring at me from behind that dirty blonde hair. I opened the door of the car and yanked the thing out. It felt like I was pulling at a scarecrow. It fell to the ground and I stomped on its head a couple of times in anger, but it didn't even bother trying to fight back. Instead, it propped itself into a sitting position and continued staring at me. "Screw you," I told it as I got in its car and drove off. It was still there, sitting down as I looked in the rearview window. The entire situation just kept getting worse and worse. I felt like I was going insane. I was going to drive out of town and then just keep driving until I ran out of gas. And then I would never think about what happened here ever again. My phone rang a couple of times, Mr. Grayson's number, but I didn't bother picking it up. "We've got a special dedication up next," the voice on the radio said. "It's dedicated to the guy in the red pickup truck, currently driving on Sawyer Street. Good luck, buddy." I instantly stopped the car, almost causing an accident, and I got out of it as Every Breath You Take by the Police started playing. I left it on the side of the road and decided that I was going to wait for the bus out of town at the station. It was only about 20 minutes or so away anyway. I probably should have been more freaked out by what had just transpired, but at that point, I had been through so much already that it barely fazed me. I sat down on the bench in the bus station, waiting for the bus to show up and free me. It was dark and quiet outside, which normally would be scary, but in this situation, I welcomed not being near anyone. This silence was cut short by my phone buzzing with a message. A message from my girlfriend. "Hey, where are you? It's getting pretty late. I'm worried about you," the message read. I chuckled out loud when I read it. A few minutes later, another message and then another. When I got a phone call from her number, I just threw the phone in a trash can. To be honest, I was scared of hearing her voice, especially knowing that it wasn't hers. I mean, it couldn't be her, after what I did to her. I remembered it crystal clear. I dropped to my knees and cried for a bit in the station after that, and then I laughed for a bit at the absurdity of the situation, and then I cried again some more. Something about that just broke me mentally. I sat on my knees some more and no bus showed up. The phone just continued to ring from the trash can. The bus never showed up. I just wanted to give up right then and there, but I couldn't. I couldn't let those things win. I knew that I wasn't crazy. I don't know if it was the conviction or just pathetic desperation and nothing else, but I got up. I don't remember the next couple of days. I remember that I decided to leave through the outskirts of the town through the wilderness, but I don't remember anything that happened for a while after that. I think I was just broken mentally. What I do remember is being handcuffed by a pair of cops on the side of a highway around a week later, covered in dirt and bleeding. I remember that I didn't even struggle. I remember spitting in the officer's face as he was reading down my rights, which led to them kicking me while I was on the ground for a bit. I couldn't care less. I was completely lethargic by that point. I remember the arrest took place next to a red pickup truck. "Are you arresting me for killing my girlfriend?" I asked the officer driving the car. "Your girlfriend's fine. She's the one that reported you missing," he told me. I don't think that he was lying. It was probably what he genuinely believed. "My girlfriend's dead. That's a thing wearing her skin that told you that," I told him, knowing full well that he wouldn't believe me. "You've completely lost your mind, haven't you?" the officer asked me in a condescending tone. "Your colleague next to you was one of those things too. You can tell because he hasn't taken his sunglasses off. That's the window to the soul," I said, more talking to myself than anything. The officer laughed. "Is that right, Richard? Are you actually a skin-stealing monster?" the officer asked mockingly. "Yep," the thing wearing Richard's skin responded. They both laughed and I laughed too. I spent a few months in a mental hospital afterwards. I listened to countless doctors tell me how apparently I had been diagnosed with psychosis my entire life and I hadn't taken my medication in a few months. Of course, none of that had ever happened. I had never even taken a psychological exam in my life before, but it's what my patient sheet said, so I agreed with it. I agreed with everything that the doctors told me. None of those things existed. My girlfriend had been alive the entire time. No Mr. Grayson had ever existed. I just nodded my head and smiled the entire time. When they eventually decided that I wasn't a danger to myself or other people, they released me. I was picked up by my girlfriend Sarah and eventually moved back into the apartment with her, and started back on my graphic design job. That's how my life has been since then. It's returned to a superficial sense of normalcy. Now let's get one thing perfectly clear. I'm not crazy. I did kill my girlfriend. I know that this thing that lives with me is just something wearing her skin, but I ignore it. I ignore the feeling of burning hatred that I can feel come from the eyes hidden behind her hair. I ignore it when she sits in the corner of the room at night, staring into nothingness. When she convulses on the couch at the fact that she hasn't spoken one word to me since I met her again. I don't care enough to do anything about it. The things haven't gone away either. If anything, they become even more aggressive now with their expansion. I would say that around half the neighborhood is one of those things right now if I had to guess. There's a kid with hair over his eyes that sits outside in front of my apartment block all day. The old lady downstairs that sits with her face pressed against the window for hours at a time. The other day I saw the mailman bend his body so he could crawl around a pipe on the side of the building. I just ignore all of it. Sometimes when I'm out walking, I'll see Mr. Grayson, or the thing wearing his skin, down at the bar or something. It smiles at me every time that it sees me. This morning I woke up and walked into the living room. My girlfriend sitting in the corner of the room, staring into nothingness again, and I sighed. "Hey, I'm going to the store. You need anything?" I asked my girlfriend Sarah. Her body just convulsed wildly. I think that was a no. It was around 7 in the morning, so it was early enough for what I had in mind. I walked to the store where this entire thing had started. It felt like a lifetime ago by then. Jeremy was at the counter still slouched over and breathing heavily. His long greasy black hair down to his shoulders by now, sweaty from the summer heat and stuck to his face and neck like black tentacles. I put a bottle of Coke on the counter, but that's not why I was there. And he seemed to know it too because he slightly raised his head to get a better look at me. He nodded as if to acknowledge my presence. "You know that I know what you are, right?" I asked. Jeremy nodded his head in that disgusting, inhuman fashion. "So?" Jeremy muttered in that voice that almost sounded human, but not quite. I shrugged, I laughed. Jeremy smiled at me with a snake-like smile, and I laughed some more. I don't know why it was so funny to me, but I couldn't really stop laughing. He was right, so what? I'm surrounded by skin-stealing monsters, and I know this, and I can't do anything about it. It was so funny, so absurd. It's like I'm an insect struggling inside the mouth of a Venus flytrap. I laughed all the way back home. I laughed as I entered my apartment. My girlfriend Sarah still shaking in the corner of the room. I laughed as I sat down on the couch and turned on the television and watched a world leader give a speech. His shoulders slouched, hair over his eyes. I was going to escape. Not by digging a tunnel or scaling a wall or bribing a guard. I was going to escape by studying. You see, I lived in a small town miles from anywhere, and the older that I got, the more it felt like I was imprisoned. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do, no jobs with prospects. My prison did not have any perimeter walls, but its dusty main road, dreary buildings, and stifling atmosphere felt just as bad to me. That was why I needed to get out. I was going to work hard at school. I was going to read the textbooks that I was meant to read, rather than the graphic novels about warped superheroes, which had been my go-to literature in the past. I was going to spend time using the online resources recommended by my teachers, not immersed in games set after an apocalypse. With the grades that I got as a result of this, there would be a whole load of academic institutions that would welcome me with open arms. All the ones that I had applied to were a long way from my hometown. I would have well and truly escaped. But it didn't work out like that. I couldn't finish a single chapter in a textbook or stay on the right page online before my attention wandered to something more interesting. The TV, a free trial of a must-play game, a new novel. I was surrounded by distractions. What chance did I have? So, by the time that I had handed my essays in and sat in the tests, I was no more educated than I had been a few months before. I had watched some great shows, zapped my way to close to a record score, and read some amazing graphic novels. But none of those counted in my favor as far as the universities were concerned. My applications were all dead in the water and I was stuck. A lifer. One morning a few weeks ago, I was staring into my bowl at the cereal and I sighed. I sighed a lot. My dad was pouring more syrup over his pancakes and my mom was drinking iced tea and reading a magazine. I sighed again. My mom looked up from her magazine. The people on the front cover all looked like $1 million but were wallowing in scandal according to the captions. "You know what you need," she said. Here comes a lecture, I thought, and I didn't even have the strength to sigh. What you need to do, she continued, is to get a job. The convenience store out of town is hiring. My cousin Betty saw a sign on their window. I moved the cereal around inside the bowl with my spoon and thought that for once my mom was right. It was time for me to take drastic measures. It was time for me to get a job. I told myself that it would just be a temporary thing as well, working in a store, because I would reapply to the universities after I had done some serious studying, and then resat my tests and resubmitted my essays and gained dazzling grades. And then I would be gone, a free man. I headed for the door and made a vow that this time I would stick to the plan. The store that Mom had been talking about was situated by the road in scrubland outside of town. There were no other buildings, and I guessed people shopped there because they were passing by, and it was easier than finding somewhere that looked less shabby. As I got out of the car and looked up at the faded lettering painted in the window saying, "Open 24 hours a day, and we've got buckets of bargains," I started to have second thoughts. No one in my hometown ever went to this store as far as I knew. Everybody shopped at the local discount store on Main Street and swore that it was the best in the world. It was run by one family and it had been forever, so there was no chance of me getting a job there. I hesitated. I really did need to do something to change my life, and if that was getting a job in the out-of-town convenience store, then so be it. Sometimes you just have to reach for the stars, or push the door and step inside. There was air conditioning on in the store, but all its energy seemed to be going on making a loud rattling noise, rather than lowering the temperature. Conscious that I was dripping with sweat, I wiped my sleeve across my forehead and tried to flatten down my hair, so that I looked smart enough to hire. I hadn't been able to see a notice in the window advertising for staff, but was working on the assumption that they were still looking, and that a bright and eager young man like me, with no hair sticking up as far as I could tell, would be a definite for the job. Now I just needed to find somebody in charge. There was a couple of tills near the entrance staffed by two lethargic-looking men. They didn't look much older than me. One of them had a wispy mustache growing above his upper lip, and the other had a tattoo coiling up his neck. They both wore t-shirts with "Ask me about today's special deals" printed on them. Neither had batted an eyelid at me, and knowing what today's special deals were would have to wait as far as I was concerned, so I ignored them and headed down one of the numerous aisles. The shelves were stacked high with cans and boxes and packs of food and household items. The arranging of them looked pretty chaotic to me at first glance, with things like jars of coffee balanced on sacks of dry dog food, bookended by apples that were starting to turn. But what did I know? I was new to the retail industry, but keen to learn. I thought this as I looked around for any sign of someone who might be a manager. There were a handful of shoppers piling cans and the rest in trolleys, and another young man who must have worked there because he was restocking shelves and wearing a matching t-shirt, but there was still no sign of a boss. I reached the end of the aisle and was standing there deciding whether to go left or right, when I realized that I was being eyeballed. The man who was staring at me was dressed in a beige uniform that looked vaguely like the type that law enforcement officers wore, but he was no cop. He was clearly a store security guard, and it turned out that he seemed to think that I was up to no good. He stuck out his chest and growled, "I've been keeping my eyes on you boys since you came in the store. You don't seem much interested in buying anything, but you are having a good look round. You sizing the joint up, boy. You planning a heist?" His voice rose in volume as he said these last words. I figured he was hoping that I would crack under pressure and admit that I was a desperado, but instead I said, "No sir, I'm just looking for a job." His chest deflated, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone up a couple of octaves. "Oh well, dang. I thought there was going to be some action here. Dang. You said you're looking for a job. Come with me." And with that, he wheeled sharply away and set off walking along the ends of the aisles. I fell into step behind him. At last, I seemed to be getting somewhere. We walked past the last of the aisles, around precarious-looking stacks of empty boxes, over a cable coiled across the floor, and into a narrow corridor at the end of which was a door with a small sign on it saying, "Store Manager." "Y'all want to knock on here, son," the security guard said. "Then good luck." And then he strode off, with a determined expression on his face. Desperados of the world beware, I thought. I flattened down my hair one last time, and then I knocked on the door. A woman's voice drifted out telling me to enter. I turned the handle and I went in. The office was cramped and poorly lit, and dominated by a desk that was overflowing with paper. The woman who was sitting behind the desk smiled at me. Now, some people say that you shouldn't judge on first impressions. Others say that the first 5 seconds after you meet someone new determines the rest of your relationship, professional or otherwise, for the duration. The woman behind the desk looked tired and kind of sad, kind of weighed down, and I immediately liked her. People that radiated success were my antimatter. Whether it was the popular and good-looking kids at school or entrepreneurs online, I felt driven away from them. People like this woman who appeared to find life a struggle were much more my type. I would say that she was in her late 30s. She wore a dark business suit and had blonde hair that hung loose. Her jacket had a lot of stray blonde hairs on it, and I noticed as well that her fingernails were bitten to the quick. She was still looking at me and smiling, and I realized that she was waiting for me to say something. I thought quickly and came up with the less than brilliant opening line of, "Hi, how you doing today?" "Oh yes, hello," she said, her smile wavering. "I'm okay, thank you. I'm Donna, the store's manager. Can I help you with something? Do you have a complaint about something that you bought here? Our no returns policy is clearly marked throughout the store." After a moment's confusion, I worked out that she thought that I was an unhappy customer. "Oh no, I'm actually here hoping that you would give me a job." "I see," she replied. "Do you have any retail experience? And do you have your resume with you and the names and contact details of 2 referees?" I had none of those things, so I stood there feeling flustered. Getting a job was stressful. She looked at me. Her eyes were blue and a bit bloodshot and impossible to read. I couldn't tell whether she was about to tell me to stop wasting her time and leave or take pity on me. She turned her attention to the storm of papers strewn across her desk. She extracted one sheet, studied it for a moment, and then turned back to me and said, "I don't have any vacancies in the day shift, which leaves the night shift. For the night shift, I prefer to hire those who might struggle to find work elsewhere. I believe in giving them a chance to earn an honest living, no matter what baggage they might have. You're clearly an ordinary kid whose face fits in the crowd, so you don't need a helping hand from me. But having said that, I am short of staff for the night shift this week, so I could offer you temporary work. How does that sound?" It wasn't what I had been hoping for, but I decided to go for it. "It sure is," I said. "What time do I start?" Her smile turned to full beam, and then she told me, "The night shift starts tonight at 10 p.m., so if you arrive 20 minutes early, you can have your introduction before you begin your first shift." And then we shook hands, and that was it. I was employed. I went home and spent the rest of the day in a happy daze. I imagined how this could be the start of a brilliant career for me. I might not even need to go to university. I'd be such a success in the night shift that I would be offered the job of deputy store manager, and within a few months, I would be running my own store and then my own chain of stores. I'd be a millionaire by 30. I would have a sports car and a private jet, and my girlfriend would be a fashion model. I might even be on the front of a glossy magazine. The front door closed and I heard my mom calling out, "You better have done your chores." It brought me back down to reality. I looked around the kitchen. The sink was still piled high with dishes. The refuse bin was overflowing. "I'm sorry, I don't have time," I called back. "I have to go to work." And then I hurried out the back door. I made my getaway and then parked up a couple of miles away and sent my mom a message explaining about my new job at the store and how that I would see her and Dad for breakfast. Then I put my phone in my pocket and I drove on. I didn't want to be late for my first night at work. As it was, I was early. There had been zero traffic on the road to slow me down. Not a single vehicle heading the same way. In fact, I didn't even see headlights in the distance. By the time that I parked up outside the store, I was wondering if the night shift was going to be very quiet and intensely boring. Sitting there, watching the evening sky redden, I hardly saw any customers entering or leaving the store. Yep, I thought. They call this a graveyard shift for a reason. By the time that I dragged myself out of my car and trudged over to the store, I was feeling as lethargic as the two till clerks that looked earlier. They were still there, sitting by their tills in these stupid t-shirts, serving no one. Once again, they ignored me. And once again, I blanked them as I walked on by. I saw the same security guard patrolling the aisles and gave him a thumbs up. "Hey, I got the job," I called over to him. He grinned back and I carried on to the manager's office. Her door was open, so I went right in. She had her head in her hands and I had the awful feeling that she might have been crying, which left me standing there wondering if I should say something or quietly back out of the room. I was still trying to decide when she looked up. "Hi again, it's me," I said, once more displaying my brilliant conversational skills. She sniffed and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and told me to follow her. Relieved that we were skirting over the whole her being upset thing, I did just that. It was time for my introduction. She showed me where the fire exit was in the staff room for when it was my break. She showed me the storeroom and the walk-in refrigerated area where perishable goods were kept before they were put out for sale. This was basically a very chilly room that made my teeth chatter while I stood there listening to her explain. There was a small door at the far side of this room marked "Deep Freeze." There was another sign below spelling out in red letters, "No entry." I was about to ask her what was in there when she led me back out into the front of the store. The lethargic store assistants were getting ready to leave, along with the other assistant that I had seen stacking shelves in the morning and the security guard as well. Donna said goodbye to them in turn, and that left just the two of us in the store as far as I could see. She smiled and said, "The rest of the night shift staff will be here soon. In the meantime, are you good with manning the fort?" I answered with a smile of my own and she left. I scratched my head and I looked out the window. It was dark by now, a clear night though. I yawned and was still yawning when the door opened and the oldest man that I had ever seen in my life had walked in. His wrinkles had wrinkles. His eyes were watery and most of the hair on his head was sprouting from his ears. He was stooped forward and walking incredibly slowly and wheezing every step of the way. He was also wearing the beige imitation cop uniform of a security guard. Now, I was brought up to respect my elders and honestly I did, but this was one ancient dude. No way that he could cut it as any kind of enforcer of law and order, even in a convenience store in the middle of nowhere. He lifted his head to look at me, and I was surprised that there wasn't a creaking sound, and then he carried on his way inch by torturous inch. I shook my head, and then I noticed that someone else had appeared while I was watching the security guard. The girl walking through the door was about my age. She was 5 foot nothing tall and had long jet black hair that matched her fingernails and lipstick. She also had very pale skin or makeup on, which made her look washed out in a cool goth kind of way. I knew even less about makeup than I knew about girls. The color of night trend continued with her clothes. Her knee-length dress was paired with black stockings and black boots. Despite the cooling temperature of the late hour, I started to feel hot again. She was gorgeous, and she had noticed that I was staring at her. My cheeks began to burn. An 18-year-old man blushing was not a good look, I knew, but there was nothing that I could do about it, and she was headed right towards me. "Hey," she said. "I'm Katie. You must be new here. It's nice to meet you." She held out her hand. I stared at it for far too long, knowing that I was meant to shake it, but the signal between my brain and my hand had gone missing. I made a grunting sound instead and waved at her, even though she was just standing a few feet in front of me. She looked embarrassed and sounded unsure when she said, "Well, welcome to the team. I look forward to working with you." And then she headed off, leaving me standing there feeling like the complete loser that I was. I grimaced and shook my head, and tried to think of a reason that I could resign and go home and hide in my room. My train of thought was interrupted by the sight of 2 more new arrivals. They were not moving as slowly as the security guard, but they were shuffling along at a very sedated pace. They had vacant expressions on their faces, and when neither of them acknowledged me, I knew that these 2 must be working the tills. And sure enough, they lowered themselves into the seats behind the little conveyor belts and sat there looking like the dictionary definition of lethargic. I left them to it and I wandered down an aisle. The manager had explained to me earlier that one of my tasks was to check for any gaps on the shelves and to restock them. I was considering a display of giant value cereal boxes when Katie had reappeared. She was wearing a t-shirt over her dress which read, "Our prices will still be low when the sun rises." I saw that she had another 3 identical t-shirts draped over her arm. She smiled and held one out to me. I didn't think before I opened my mouth and said, "Oh, no way do I have to wear one of those. They're so dumb." Katie flinched and looked at her feet. "Oh, okay," she said. "It's just that I make them myself. I want to work in fashion and Donna pays me a bit extra to create new t-shirts for the staff and build up my portfolio." Still not looking at me, she walked away. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me at that point. Until a few minutes ago, there had been the fraction of a chance of anything romantic happening between me and this beautiful young woman. Now there was 0 likelihood. I smacked my forehead with the palm of my hand and said out loud, "Idiot," and then I went back to looking for gaps on the shelves. But my heart was not in it, and as time dragged on, and the occasional shopper drifted by in the background, I found myself standing back near the tills. I had not replenished a single thing, and it was not even midnight, and I understood now as well why the 2 till assistants looked so devoid of enthusiasm. One of them was serving a customer, slowly moving each item over the scanner, and when it had beeped, putting the item in a cardboard bag. There was a dull rhythm to this which was strangely hypnotizing, and I found myself listening for the beep of the scanner, watching his hand carrying the item across, listening for the beep. And then I noticed a fly circling his head, and another one crawling across his cheek, and this brought me out of my daze. He did not seem to be aware of the flies though. He just continued swiping. The other till assistant, meanwhile, was staring blankly into space. They were both wearing one of Katie's t-shirts. As I looked at these, I felt a fresh wave of regret and decided that I needed to snap out of it and to do the right thing. I went to find her to apologize and to tell her that I really wanted a t-shirt. She was in the storeroom opening yet another cardboard box. I took a deep breath and I went in. "Hey, I'm sorry about earlier. I was wondering if I could still have a t-shirt. You know, to be a part of the team." I mean, you've got one on and both the guys at the tills. Sorry, I don't know their names. It's Frank and Frank, she told me. She sounded and looked brighter when she said this, and my spirits rose as well. Seriously? I replied with a smile on my face. They're both called Frank. She nodded. Yeah, I think so. And they never really talk, so it's hard to be sure. But that's what I call them, and neither of them had ever corrected me. Hey, fair enough, I said. How about the security guard? Is he Frank as well? She laughed, and that made me feel even better. Oh no, silly, she said. That's Mr. Oliver. He's lovely, and he's a very good security guard. I didn't try and say anything funny about his age. I just agreed, and when Katie told me that she had to get back to work, I returned to my shelf, checking with a spring in my step. A little while later, Katie walked past and smiled at me. I had noticed that she never seemed to show her teeth when she smiled. She must have had a retainer, I figured, and was self-conscious about it. Something which made her even more attractive in my eyes. I moved to a new aisle, still looking for those gaps. My mind soon started wandering again, and I started feeling bad for not checking to see if my mom had replied to my message. I assumed using a phone while working was frowned on, so I checked and there was no sign of the manager, so I took out my phone. There was a reply from my mom sent not long after I had messaged her. She said that she was happy that I had followed her advice, and asked if I was rushed off my feet. That made me laugh. I was the opposite. I thought the best way to explain would be to send her a little film of the deserted aisles. Keeping my phone low to try and be discreet, I turned on the camera and, without looking into it, panned across the aisle. Capturing a whole lot of nothing, I thought only just at the moment that Katie walked past the end of the aisle that I had been filming. I turned the camera off, but she had not noticed me and was soon out of sight. I considered not sending the video to my mom, but decided, hey, what the heck. Katie would have only been in it for a couple of seconds. My mom wouldn't care. I attached the clip and pressed a reply to my mom's message, and then immediately hid the phone back in my pocket. I didn't want to push my luck. With rule breaking over, I went back to the shelves and their gaps. Around 2 a.m., Donna came out of her office and told me that it was time for my 20-minute break. My stomach was grumbling, but I had not brought anything to eat or drink with me, which wasn't a problem considering where I was. I got some chips, a pepperoni stick, and a can of cola off the shelves, and I went to the tills to pay. There were no customers. The security guard was sat on a plastic chair by the entrance. His head was drooping, and I think that he might have been asleep. The two assistants, the two Franks, if Katie was right about their names, were sat at their tills looking blankly ahead. There were more flies on them, and it struck me for the first time that their skin had a grayish tint to it. Hey, I said to them. I guess it doesn't matter which one of you guys serves me. A pretty dumb thing to say, but I was trying to be friendly. The two Franks turned their heads slowly and gazed at each other for a minute. As crazy as it sounds, it felt like they were almost having a silent conversation. And then one of them looked at me and raised his hand. I figured he was indicating that he would serve me, so I put my items on his conveyor belt. Grindingly slowly, he picked each up in turn and moved them over the scanner. 3 beeps sounded. I paid, picked up my stuff, and headed to the staff room. When I arrived, my heart did a little jump. Katie was there. She was engrossed in reading a paperback book but looked up as I entered. I apologized for disturbing her. No, it's not a problem, she replied and closed the book. So, how's your first shift going? She asked. Feeling delighted that she wanted to know, I grinned at her and said, Not bad. I just got served by one of the Franks. It was a bit of an odd experience. Oh, don't worry about it, she told me. They're a bit eccentric, sure, but I like them. They live out by the old military base. There's a whole community out there living off-grid. I've been past and seen them, but I've never visited. I think most of them are ex-military that used to work at the base. I nodded enthusiastically. The old military base was one of those places my parents had always warned me to avoid, though they had never really said why. There were rumors about secret experiments and cover-ups, but I'd always dismissed those as conspiracy theories. I was considering if I should ask Katie if she wanted to drive out there in the daytime and see what was really going on, when she got to her feet and told me that she needed to get back to work. I was left with butterflies in my stomach and thinking how hanging out with Katie was the most amazing thing. And then I demolished my snacks and went back to work. I was getting the hang of my job by now and learning where everything was in the storeroom when I needed to replenish a shelf. I was carrying a 4-pack of tinned fruit to its new home, feeling pleased with myself when I saw a customer standing halfway along an aisle. He was tall and skinny and was wearing a long baggy coat that was too big for him. There was something about him that set off an alarm bell in my head, and I paused, wondering if he was up to no good. And sure enough, he reached out, picked up a big block of cheese and put it inside his coat, and then he moved down the aisle and did the same with a tin of processed meat. My heart began to race. This guy was a shoplifter, and somebody needed to challenge him. If the security guard that I had met the day before had been on duty, I would have found him and told him what was happening, and he could have taken care of the thief. But standing there as the man pocketed another 10, I thought about the old ancient security guard. He would be no use whatsoever. I made a decision. I put down the tins that I was carrying and I walked towards the shoplifter with a determined expression on my face. "You," I said, trying to sound like I meant business. "I saw what you're doing." He looked at me. There was a coldness in his eyes. He didn't look in the least a bit scared of me. He even started to smile. I swore to myself, realizing that I had made a mistake, but it was too late for me to back out now. He was muttering obscenities at me, and his fists were clenched. And suddenly, he lashed out. His punch hit me on the chin and I fell backwards as pain flared from where I had been struck. Then as he stepped over me, he brought his boot down onto my stomach. The pain from this new blow took my breath away and I curled up into a ball to try and protect myself. But he was walking away. I heard him laugh and then lost sight of him. And I was lying there groaning when I heard someone say, "What's happened?" I glanced up and it was Donna, and Katie was behind her. They both looked shocked and concerned. I tried to sit up. "This man, he was stealing things," I managed to say. "I tried to stop him." Donna and Katie both came over to me and helped me to my feet. And then Donna shook her head and said, "You shouldn't have done that. You might have been seriously injured or worse. Next time, you alert the security guard and let him handle things. Is that clear?" She was clearly angry with me, and that surprised me. I could only mumble an apology and a promise that it would never happen again. Still shaking her head, Donna asked Katie to take me to the staff room and sit with me for a while to check that I was okay. Back in the staff room, I rubbed my chin and felt my stomach, and decided the only serious harm that had been done was to my pride. "Hey, don't feel bad," Katie told me. "Donna used to run the store with her husband. They were childhood sweethearts and got married around the time that they took on the place. Last year, her husband confronted a shoplifter. The man turned violent and Donna's husband was badly injured. Her voice started to break. She took a deep breath and said, "He died." I understood then why Donna had reacted the way that she had to my naive attempt to stop the shoplifter. After asking me if I was going to be alright, Katie went back to work and I was left with a lot to think about. Not least the fact that I was by now hopelessly in love with Katie. I wanted to marry her and live in a house with a picket fence. We would have 3 children and a barbecue in the backyard every Sunday in the summer. Of course, I would have to get the courage to ask her out on a date first, and then sooner rather than later introduce her to my parents. Thinking of them made me remember the last message that I had sent my mom. Wondering if she had seen it and replied, I took out my phone. The words, "Message failed to send," was on the screen, and I saw that I had no reception. It wasn't a problem. My mom was probably fast asleep anyway, and I would be seeing her in only a few hours. I started to put my phone back into my pocket, and then I stopped. I wanted to watch the film so that I could see the few seconds that Katie had been in it. She was so beautiful. I pressed play. The view passed along the shelves and along the empty aisle until it reached the end, where Katie had walked past, and should have been caught on film. But she wasn't there. It was only more empty space. Frowning, I pressed play again. No, she wasn't in the film, which was weird. I was about to check for a third time when Donna stuck her head around the door and asked me how I was feeling. I wanted to tell her how sorry I was about her husband, but I figured that now wasn't the best time. So I told her that I was fine and ready to get back to work. There must have been a few more customers in because there were new gaps on the shelves. Not for long, I said out loud to myself and set off to the storeroom. After a while, I started to feel hungry again. A candy bar that I could eat while working would be ideal, I thought, and after choosing one, I headed to the tills. The security guard was still by the entrance, still borderline comatose. The Franks were still staring off into space. And the door was opening and 2 men were entering the store. They had plastic masks covering their faces and they were armed. I froze. This was a nightmare, one that unfolded at speed. One of the intruders began to shout, telling us not to do anything stupid. The other checked out the rest of the store, returning moments later with Katie and Donna. They had their hands on their heads and looked as terrified as I felt. And then the first intruder yelled at the Franks to open their tills, which they did but at their own slow pace. This drove the intruder crazy and he began to scream at them. Katie began to cry and this got her screamed at as well. Everything was escalating, and I had a sickening feeling that someone was going to get badly hurt. The only person that was not freaking out was the ancient security guard, Mr. Oliver. All the shouting had woken him up, but he was just sitting in his chair by the entrance. He scratched his chin and looked at the intruders. "Now then, fellas," he said, his voice scratchier than an old vinyl record. "There's no need for all this threatening. Why don't you head on out and we'll forget about this whole thing?" The intruders looked at him for a minute and then burst out laughing. Mr. Oliver tutted and said, "I gave you a fair warning." And then he got slowly to his feet. There was a cracking sound as he did. I thought this was his old bones protesting and having to move. And he did wince as if he was in pain. And then he arched his back and his arms reached out, and he began to change. Thick dark hair began to grow from his face and his hands. His fingers stretched out, and he kept on growing. The nails on the end of each finger were lengthening as well. I watched in horror as they changed into razor-sharp claws. The rest of his body was also expanding. His uniform tore open in places to reveal not skin but a pelt. His shoes split and paws were exposed, each tipped with a vicious-looking claw. The feeble, slow old man had been transformed into a wolf that stood upright. It threw back its head and howled and then turned its gaze on the intruders. Its fangs glistened with drool, and its eyes sparkled with murderous intent. Transfixed by fear, the intruders stared at the creature which the old man had become. It began to snarl and took a step towards them. The intruders dropped their weapons, turned tail, and ran out of the store. I stood there with my mouth hanging open. "Isa," I began to say. I wanted to say shapeshifter, but surely they only existed in the realms of comic books and TV series. and yet there was one standing a few feet from me. It was no longer snarling and was not showing any signs of aggression to those of us left in the store. And then things got even more bizarre. Donna walked up to the creature and patted its arm and said, "Thank you, Mr. Oliver. I don't think we'll have any more trouble from those two." In response, the creature smiled. I swear on all that's good it did. It smiled and then sat down and shrunk back into an old man. His uniform was still torn, his shoes split open, but now all there was wrinkly skin and chipped toenails. My mouth was still open. Donna noticed and turned to me and said, "Other businesses wouldn't employ Mr. Oliver as a security guard because of his age. Well, I saw past that and gave him a chance. This is not the first time that he has repaid my trust." And then she headed back in the direction of her office. Katie, meanwhile, was giving Mr. Oliver a hug. The Franks were nodding slowly. I finally shut my mouth and went to the restroom. I needed to splash some cold water on my face. I went back to work after this, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just witnessed. I had to know more, and for that, I needed to go all the way to the top. I finished replacing some kitchen rolls and detergent bottles and then went to the manager's office. On the way, I saw her going into the refrigerated area. Maybe she needs to cool down as well after all the excitement, I thought, with a nervous smile on my face, and I followed her. She had already crossed the length of the room by the time that I entered, and was opening the door marked "Deep Freeze." I carried on after her but hesitated at the door. The sign saying "No entry" was clear. I shouldn't go in, but I was just so desperate for an explanation. I decided to go for it. I turned the handle and opened the door, very slowly and as quietly as I could. Basically, I was sneaking in and feeling guilty about it. Once the door was open wide enough, I peered into the room. It was dimly lit and waves of freezing air were making my skin burn, and the inside of my mouth because once again it was hanging open. Donna was standing in the middle of the room talking to a man who was frozen solid inside a large block of ice. Through the layer of ice, I could see that his veins beneath his pale skin and that his eyes were closed. Donna was speaking very quietly, and I couldn't hear what she was saying, but as I stood there watching, she smiled at the human popsicle, then blew it a kiss and turned away, and saw me. I was mortified. I knew that I shouldn't have been there. I started to mumble an apology, but Donna held up a hand to stop me and asked me to come with her to her office. I trailed after her. I was still shaking even after I left the cold rooms. I thought that I was about to be fired. She asked me to take a seat, which I gratefully accepted before my legs gave way. And then she looked at me and said, "The man you just saw me talking to was my husband. He was mortally wounded in a robbery attempt. I expect that Katie's already told you that. What she doesn't know is that after the incident, when I could see that he was dying, I dragged him into the deep freeze. I was out of my mind with shock, but a part of me was thinking that if I froze him, then I could keep him alive." Tears fell down her face as she spoke, and she didn't try and wipe them away as she went on. "Afterwards, I lied and told the other staff that I had called the paramedics and that the cops that they were on their way. And then I sent the staff home and closed the store. And after that, I went back into the deep freeze and sat with my husband and talked to him until dawn. All the while, the ice particles were forming around his body. And now every night, I go into the deep freeze and I talk to him. I tell him how the store's doing, and I tell him that I love him and then I go back out to work." She finally wiped a hand across her cheek, and then she took a deep breath. "So, that's it. That's my secret," she said. Acting with my heart rather than my head, I stood up and went over to her side of the desk and asked if it was okay to give her a hug. She nodded, so I held her gently for a moment and told her that her secret was safe with me. And then I did the only thing that I could think of. I went back to work. Dawn was only an hour or so away and I was feeling pretty wiped out, but I wasn't going to slack off. As well as my feelings for Katie, I had really come to like Donna and Mr. Oliver, and even the Franks too. And I knew that there was so much about them and the store that I was still to discover. That could wait until my next shift, I thought, because nothing else was going to happen that night. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with the roar of a motorbike engine outside, and then a second and a third, and so they went. I hurried to the front of the store to see what was happening. The Franks were at their tills and Mr. Oliver was in his chair. Katie and Donna joined us moments later. We looked out into the darkness and saw half a dozen or so motorbikes lined up facing the store. The drivers revved their engines in turn. All the motorbikes had passengers and they were climbing off and staring at the store. They were all carrying. I felt a trickle of cold sweat run down my neck. This was trouble. "Who are they?" Katie asked. "Varmints," Mr. Oliver replied. "I can see the two lowlifes who tried robbing the store earlier. Looks like they brought their pack back with them to take revenge." The drivers were getting off their motorbikes as well, and it felt to me like there was a feral army out there, and that we were their prey trapped in the store. "We should call the cops," Katie said. By the time they get here, it'll be too late," Mr. Oliver replied. "I can take some of them out, but not enough." My heart sank even further. The odds of us getting out of this situation alive felt like they were dropping by the second. I turned to Donna, desperately hoping that she would have an idea to save us, but she was speaking quietly to the Franks. They were nodding slowly, seeming to understand, and when Donna finished, they rose and walked to the entrance, where they stood staring out into the distance. I got the feeling that they were staring beyond the biker gang, somehow reaching out deep into the scrublands. Whatever it was that they were doing, it did not matter anymore. The bikers were advancing in a ragtag line on the store. They were taking their time. They had their weapons propped on their shoulders and looked like they were enjoying this, taking sick pleasure from the terror that they must have known we were experiencing inside the store. Nausea rose inside me and I was on the verge of tears. I didn't want to die, not like this. And all the while the bikers came closer and closer, and all we could do was watch helplessly. And then Katie pointed into the distance. "Look," she exclaimed. I couldn't see what she meant at first, but then I saw them. There were figures approaching from the distance. They were moving slowly, walking with an odd and uneven gait. They were a shuffling, shambling group, and there were a lot of them, a couple of dozen, maybe more. "Who are they?" I asked breathlessly. The Franks answered, their voices overlapping. They said in a guttural drawl, "Frank." What the freaking? I began to think but never got to the end, because the bikers had seen that they had company now. One of the bikers span around and opened fire. He hit one of the approaching figures in the chest. It stopped in its tracks, looked down at the smoldering hole which ran all the way through its body, then raised its arms and bared its teeth, and started walking forward again, right at the biker who had fired at it. I couldn't see his face, but I heard his scream as the figure bit into his shoulder. And all around this gruesome encounter, more and more of the bikers were being overwhelmed by the strange figures which had emerged from the night and saved us. I turned away. With a hysterical laugh bubbling up inside me, I thought of a new staff t-shirt slogan, "Saved by Zombies." Because that's what those things must have been. Because that's what the till assistants, the Franks, were. and somehow they had called in the undead cavalry. It was all clear to me now. Zombies and a shapeshifter. Donna wasn't kidding when she had told me that she'd like to give the unemployable a chance. Adrenaline was still pulsing through my body, and I felt lightheaded as I made my way back to the aisles and went back to work. Thankfully, it was going to be light soon, which meant my first night shift was almost over. I was too tired and stressed to summon up the courage to ask Katie out. That would have to wait for another time, and perhaps after we had worked a few more night shifts together, but I did want to say goodbye. After replacing my final item of the night, I went looking for Katie, but I couldn't see her, so I headed back towards the door. She must have left already, I figured, and I looked outside at the sky. Flecks of red were appearing at the edges of the darkness, and there was something moving up there, something dark and quick. That suddenly swooped down low so that it was only inches from the door, and I saw that it was a bat and that it was looking right at me. And another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Katie. Her pale skin, the way she smiled without showing her teeth, her camera not recording her. She was another of the strange. The girl that I loved was a vampire, and before dawn rose, she needed to be away. The bat soared back up into the sky. I watched it until it was only a dot and then gone, lost to sight. Until the next night shift, I thought, and I headed for my car. I had nearly missed the call over the blare of music in my headphones as I stocked the milk in the freezer section. My mind had been split between trying to stay warm under the artificial cold of the freezer and the song that I had blaring through my headphones when I heard it from the ear that I had left free. David and Matthew to the register. I need David and Matthew at the register. My coworker's voice hissed over the ancient PA system as it blared through an ear-splitting electronic squeal into a cloud of audio snow. I slid my phone out of my pocket, checking the time. 1:23 a.m. I had 4 more hours on shift. The store was usually empty by now. The busiest hours always came hours before or after I was on shift. Having little to no customers during most of the hours there, I occupied my time by stocking the things emptied over the day, which was why it struck me as odd that I was being called to the register. I could have never imagined what was really waiting for me up there. I doubted there was some overflow of waiting shoppers building up at Chelsea's register, and I had told her only minutes prior that I would be stocking the perishables. Usually, if someone needed me this late, they would just walk over and ask. I considered whether or not to finish the task at hand, unsure of whether or not it was best to leave the milk outside of the freezer for what was an undetermined amount of time, when I heard the click of approaching footsteps on the linoleum. Chelsea approached from down one of the aisles, moving at such a brisk pace I almost immediately knew that something was up. I nodded her way, opening my mouth to ask whether whatever she needed at the register could wait until the milk was away. Yet when I saw the look on her face, the words seemed to get stuck in my throat. She was oddly pale, with a look as though she had just walked in on her own funeral, eyes wide and watery, and she was shaking like a leaf, with such force I worried for her balance. She stared at me with a 1,000-mile stare, as if she had just seen a ghost. She moved so quickly and got so close to me that I nearly backed into the freezer in surprise, when she brought her mouth to my ear and whispered, "There's someone at the register." Her voice unsteady and strained with emotion. "He won't leave, and there's something very wrong about him." When she pulled away, I could see the gleam of, I don't know, terror I suppose, in her eyes. That resolve wavering as a look that was a wide-eyed mix of unease and panic passed across her face. My mind spun at the unusual state of her. Chelsea was as cool-headed as they come. Having moved to our small town from New York, Matt and I had always joked that she was built tougher than the rest of us, and whenever there was an unruly customer to deal with, a man or woman, she never failed to handle it. A foreboding chill rippled down my spine, not from the freezer for once, sending a spasm through me as I considered the customer who could bring Chelsea to tears. Does he have a gun? She shook her head, wiping her eyes and sniffing. No, he's just standing there looking at me, and he won't speak or leave, and he keeps making this sound. Where's Matt? I asked. Matt was our coworker, and the third on the late shift with us. He and Chelsea had been dating for a few months, and started working at the Ready Mart as a way to save up for an apartment. He was a funny, cool-headed sort, who perpetually avoided conflict when it came, a perfect yin to her yang. He tended to bounce around the store like me, doing a bit of whatever needed doing, though he had a habit for extra long smoke breaks multiple times a shift. He said that he was taking out the trash out back. You were the first person that I found. It was at that point that I caught something from the corner of my eye at the far end of the nearest aisle, close to the registers. From out of my periphery for a moment, I saw someone was leaning past the shelf in a way that hardly made sense balance-wise, concealing all but their upper half, watching us tactlessly. Naturally, my eyes followed, and as I turned my head a bit to peer past Chelsea down the aisle from which she had just arrived, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a man peering behind the farthest shelf. As soon as my eyes turned to meet him, he disappeared with an almost cartoonish fervor, ducking out of sight with a jarring quickness. Pins and needles shot along my skin as I stared down at the empty hallway. Chelsea followed my gaze, eyes somehow widening further as she spun around to look where I was looking. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Everything about Chelsea's reaction and the odd, though brief glimpse of the man at the end of the aisle was making me feel like at the very least, we may be dealing with someone a little off. But still, I saw little other option than to try and see what he wanted or to ask him to leave. As distressed as Chelsea already was, I knew that I had to do something to avoid a scene, but didn't want to guarantee an escalation of things. I started down the aisle towards the register. I heard Chelsea gasp, and almost immediately her hand wrapped around my wrist, drawing me back. Don't. He's not right. Her eyes watered, but she didn't waver. A look of panicked determination emblazoned on her features as she looked into my eyes. If he's being a weirdo, I'll ask him to leave. If he won't, I'll call the cops, I assured, carefully pulling my arm free. You can stay here or head to the back and get some space if you want. She stared at me for several moments, chewing her lip as she seemed to consider things, before wiping at her eyes with the backs of her hand. No, I'll go with you. If he gets weird again, I'll call the cops. I grimaced slightly despite myself. It wasn't that I didn't trust her to do as she said, but I had never seen her in such a state before, and I worried what might happen if she continued to be around whoever it was up front. Still, I didn't feel like we had the time for an argument, and the look in her eye told me that it would take one at the very least to dissuade her, so we made our way down the aisle. It's strange. I would walk that same aisle probably hundreds of times this month, never once feeling anything at all, but watching the palpable increase in Chelsea's tension as we neared the registers made my stomach sink lower with each step. Suddenly, the bright lights in the tan floors of the store began to feel like that of a hospital, and anxiety ebbed and surged through me, as though we were walking toward the doctor for bad news. As we reached the end of the aisle, I immediately noted the strange sound growing with our approach. It was a persistent clicking, reminiscent at first of the clank of a bicycle's gears when you take your feet off the pedals. Chelsea stopped, terror managing to surpass her defenses, as she froze just as we had approached the registers. She shook her head vigorously, pressing her hands to her ears half-heartedly. The look on my face was likely as quizzical as I felt, and she offered an explanation. "I'm staying here. I don't like how he looks at me. I'll watch from right here." I was unnerved but felt no need to argue, her discomfort obvious. It was unlike her to say the least. Having worked with Chelsea and her boyfriend Matt over the past few months, I had come to develop a sort of casual friendship with the two, with them even being the only coworkers that I would actually hang out with outside of work on occasion. In that time, I had known Chelsea to be the type who reveled in the opportunity to put an out-of-line customer in their place, much to Matthew's constant chagrin. To see her like this was more than a little alarming. The odd click grew louder as I walked out of the aisle. As the line of registers came into view, so did he. In an instant, I was aware of two things. The first was that the clicking was coming from him, almost certainly the sound that Chelsea had spoken of. And the second was the smell. It was thick and sour, a stench that seemed to permeate the air as I approached, stirring an old memory. I lived down the road from a farm that has a couple of goats notorious for escape. My brothers and I would always delight in finding one roaming our property and making a game of chasing it back home. One summer when I was a kid, our neighbors had told us that one of the goats, a 3-year-old with a habit for late-night breakouts, hadn't been seen in an unusual amount of time. Around the same time, from the woods near our house, we began to smell an overwhelming stench carried by the breeze that plagued us for a couple of days. It got so bad that we wouldn't even play outside. A horrible smell like old meat left in the sun. My oldest brother found the animal's carcass not far past the tree line a few days later. Dad suspected a mountain lion had gotten a hold of it. Whatever the case, I never forgot that smell. The reek of decay now, for some reason, wafting through our convenience store. The chill I felt as I approached made me certain that someone somewhere was practically tap dancing over my grave. The man at the register wore a tattered flannel and a pair of dirty jeans that looked to have been worn for months on end without a wash. He stood with his back to me, but I could see that he was swaying, his body rocking from side to side as though he were struggling to maintain his balance. Despite the black hood that he wore, I could see that his head was cocked at an odd angle to the right. "How you doing, sir?" I called, using my customer service voice as I crossed the gulf between the register and the aisle. "Can I help you?" I rounded the opposite end of the nearest shelf, offering cheap Easter-themed candies, keeping a distance between the man and myself as I approached. I felt that day's lunch churn about in my gut as the heavy odor of rotten mildew, damp and overpowering, began to grow unbearable on approach, its source without question. The clicking sound. It came again. It reminded me vaguely of the strange chittering my cat had made the one time it escaped the house to chase a bird. Though his hoodie was up, obscuring his face, I was certain he had made the sound with his mouth, though how I wasn't so sure. It sent my gut twisting like a mound of worms, somehow even more disturbing up close. As I rounded the register, I got my first view of the man from the front. Jesus Christ. It was a testament to my self-control that I managed to limit the outburst to just a thought. He looked like walking death. His face was a sort of paper-thin and pale that I thought I'd reserved for the dead or dying, yet it appeared almost plastic, shiny and hollow, in a way that made my skin crawl. It was a mask-alike, and I couldn't peg why, but it just seemed as though his face didn't fit. Something dark red ran down his mouth and chin, and it didn't take much for me to guess what it was. The ragged condition of his lips telling me that he had chewed them near into oblivion, which only made those eyes all the more jarring. They were bloodshot, almost all of the white replaced by a pale red, and his irises were two twin pools of obsidian, boring through my skull with a glassy yet sinister stare. I shuddered out of mutual disquiet and disgust. He glared at me with those scarlet eyes, as though he were trying to peer into my thoughts. For a moment, I found my words escaping me. A strange, primal sort of fear surging through me under that gaze that felt so entirely inhuman. My heart beat with a painful thrum, so loud that I could almost hear it, as my throat seemed to go dry, making me stumble over my words. Can I help you? My words seemed to hang in the air for several long, tense seconds that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Slowly, his head cocked to the side in an almost reptilian gesture. His eyes never once wavered from my own. God, that face. It made me want to scream or attack him, or run out of the store and never look back. No amount of staring back at him made his horrific visage any more palatable. That sickly pale skin for too unnatural. The sound, it was coming from his mouth, yet his lips never once moved until the corners wavered, his smile stretching almost imperceptibly. It sounded like he was just making the K sound repeatedly, like a broken record. It wasn't like a shudder, more as if he were trying to figure out how his mouth worked, repeating the sound while staring back at me. The idea that this may be some sort of mental health or drug-related incident was beginning to seem like a sure bet. Sir, can I help you? The cold shiver that sent down my spine and made my entire body twitch, and as the man finally spoke, I felt dread begin to seep through my consciousness. He sounded like me. I mean, I've heard impressions before, but heck, I've got a few of my own I've known to whip out at parties. This was not that. He literally spoke my own words back to me as if it were a recording. Until that moment, I was certain that, as odd as things had been, the man before me was just that. For the first time, it began to occur to me that that may not be the case. Can I help you? He repeated it, and again it was as if it had a delayed echo. Welcome to Ready Mart, he chirped, now in Chelsea's voice. Make him stop, make him stop. Chelsea screamed from where she stood, clamping her hands over her ears, tears running down her face. I couldn't blame her for her reaction. At that moment, I had been struggling to come to grips with what was going on. Some small part of me was still praying that I had fallen asleep on shift again, and this was some horrifically vivid nightmare. The man thing, whatever it was, smiled at that. The first decipherable gesture he had made since entering. His head snapped around, almost a complete 180, turning to face Chelsea, though his body never once wavered, still facing me. His jaw dropped so low and with such suddenness, I was sure it must have ripped free from the bone. Stop looking at me like that. When he spoke next, a cold splash of realization hit me, and by the look on her face, Chelsea as well. Stop, leave me the heck alone, help! The uncanny recreation of Matthew's voice ended abruptly. Somehow that seemed worse than if it had continued. The look on Chelsea's face was unlike anything that I had ever seen outside of a movie. It was a strange blend of life-altering sadness, horror, and unmitigated fury all at once. It has Matthew's voice. Her voice shook as she spoke, every emotion on her face present in her words. How does it have Matthew's voice? So far, it had only been able to mimic us after hearing us, and now, it had just used Matthew's voice. The implication hung overhead like a guillotine. The fact that he still hadn't responded to the PA, or come back from his garbage run only added fuel to the fire. I did my level best to speak my next words as calmly as I could manage, which wasn't much given the state of things. "Chelsea," my voice wavered as I spoke. "Go find Matt and call the police." Chelsea nodded, but before she could even make a step to leave, the thing made a sound. It was unlike anything that I had ever heard from a living thing before. The closest things that I can compare it to are the noise that a car brake makes before an accident, or the shriek of some winged dinosaur in a movie. It was long and piercing, the sort of noise that I could feel shaking my eardrums and bones alike, and utterly unlike anything produced by human vocal cords. Chelsea doubled over, clutching her ears. I did the same, but it was too late. The pain in my head worse than any migraine I had ever had. I felt a sharp pop in my left ear, followed by a tinnitus-like ringing, and an odd, wet trickle along that side of my jaw. The man, or whatever this thing was, extended an arm pointing one abnormally long finger in Chelsea's direction. Much to her utter horror, his mouth extended lower and lower until its lower jaw hung past its collarbone, as that god-awful screeching continued. The lights flickered once and then twice and then a final third time. His ungodly wail came to an end. For a moment, there was nothing but an awful silence, broken only by the continued ringing in my ear and the flicker of the lights. It was the sort of quiet that falls right before a tornado, when everything adopts an unnatural stillness and the air is charged with a foreboding energy. I made eye contact with Chelsea, and I could see that we were both feeling it too. She was gone in an instant, darting off down the aisle towards the back of the store. She must have gotten a few feet or so when that thing let out another of its horrid cries. The lights flickered off, and then on and then off. The darkness remained thick and suffocating. My heart beat painfully as I strained to hear through the ringing, my sight now all but gone. The first thing that I heard was Chelsea cry out in surprise. The next was a sudden clamor of footsteps moving forward. On. I could see again, and the first thing I noted was that the space before me was completely empty. He was gone. "Run!" I cried, knowing that it was neither necessary nor fruitful, but it seemed the only effort I could make knowing was what to come. I darted to the register, grabbing the miniature bat that Matt had stashed under it in case of emergencies, and I broke out into a sprint towards the aisle that Chelsea had gone down, knowing that was likely where it was too. Off. Darkness again. Whatever that thing had done to the power, it seemed would be a recurring issue. My shoulder collided with one of the shelves in my blindness, wincing as the cold metal managed to cut into my arm through the sleeve of my shirt. Sharp pain radiated through it, but I kept running. Somewhere in the darkness, Chelsea's sudden scream rang out, immediately mixed with another strange cry from that thing. Odd. I could see again. My heart dropped. I was just in time to watch her face disappear as she was dragged out of the aisle and out of sight. For a brief second, we made eye contact, the unbridled terror in her face like nothing I had ever seen. I ran as fast as I could, unwilling to squander the brief moments of vision, managing to reach the end of the aisle before. Off. Ironically, it occurred to me like a light bulb going off in an instant. My phone. Between the nightmarish events and the adrenaline of the night, it had somehow escaped my mind completely. I fumbled through my pocket for the device, not even bothering to unlock it as I activated the flashlight. I quickly began to dial 911. The call sounded as though I were making it from a tunnel 600 feet under the ground, the dispatcher's voice faint and choppy. "Yeah, I'm calling from the Ready Mart on North and Stony Creek. My coworker is being attacked. I think my other one may have been." I couldn't bring myself to say killed. "Hurt. We need police immediately." Sir, for online. Though the service at the store was never the greatest, I had never experienced this level of disruption and knew immediately it was a result of that thing. I wasn't even fully sure that she had heard me, and while I knew protocol was to stay on the line, I couldn't afford to stay and talk while that creature had my friend. I ended the call and proceeded after the two. The back of the store was empty. The only thing visible near the other end of that was the rack of milk I had been stocking. A growing pool of water puddled beneath it. It occurred to me that I wasn't sure what this thing was capable of. I had already seen and heard it do the impossible, and I would surely risk a physical confrontation pursuing it. But still, it wasn't like we ran a gun store. The selection of potential weapons was limited. An idea occurred suddenly, tenuous at best, based on logic found in movies and YouTube videos. I moved carefully, heart pounding in my ear, pointing the light down each of the aisles as I passed, stopping in a few to gather what I needed. As I slid the can of cheap air spray into my pocket, already having what else I needed, a muffled cry echoed from somewhere in the store. "Chelsea, Matt," I called, proceeding again down the back of the store. The sounds of a struggle from somewhere nearby made my ear perk up. "Where are you?" I tried my best to project confidence, sounding more angry and afraid than anything. From one of the aisles beside me, something shifted, and a low hiss carried through the dark. It sounded close. "Chelsea," I called. I felt like a child walking from my room to the kitchen in the dark, the world around me suddenly full of unseen monsters. There were only a few aisles left. Chelsea and whatever it was that had her, they were bound to be in one of the next three. My stomach flipped at the realization, the suffocating feeling that I was slowly being closed in on beginning to take hold. "Hey, David." My heart lurched painfully and I nearly jumped out of my skin as I spun around. I only realized that it was Chelsea's voice after the initial shock had settled in, replaced by an immediate relief to not be faced down by some horrid nightmare creature. "Jesus Christ, you scared the crap out of me," I breathed. As I aimed the light at the end of the aisle, it caught on her face, pale and almost reflexive with what had to be sweat in the pitch black. She was peering from around the end of the shelf, only her head visible, hair twisted and matted as it curtained either side of her face. "Are you The rest of my words caught in the sudden dryness in my throat. Her smile was wide, almost cartoonish, and almost as quickly as it came, the relief had faded, replaced by a cold, heavy knot of dread. Her smile, it wasn't right, neither the context or the appearance. It stretched just a bit too wide on her face, her eyes oddly bloodshot. She or it lurched forward in an instant, as if sensing that the charade was broken, giving off something like a mix between a woman's wail and a canine's howl, utterly unnatural. I didn't have a moment to spare, as it crossed the aisle with blinding speed, hands outstretched, ending in bestial claws. I raised the aerosol can, sliding my phone into my pocket and gripping the lighter that I always carried, flicking it as soon as it was out. For those seconds, I was plunged into darkness, only the sounds of the approaching nightmare to greet me. Dear God, let this work. I pressed down on the button as I could feel the cold tips of its claws grazing my skin. A burst of flame spat forth, the heat so intense that I nearly stopped. It didn't, however, as its furious cry shifted into a dry screech, and the thing reeled away, hands flying to its face. Its head was in a blaze, the sounds it made becoming more strange and airy as fire ate away at it internally. It shook its head like a wounded animal, with such ferocity it slammed into the shelves on either side, as it scratched and clawed away at its searing skin. I should have continued, should have lit the thing from head to toe, but I was caught in a sickened awe at the gruesome sight. The smell, already that of dying things, grew sharp and warm, coating my nose and throat. As the blade sputtered to a singular flame and then a faint hiss, a strained silence fell over everything. On. The lights clicked back on with a pop, making me jump with its return. The thing glared at me, one of its eyes a ruined mess in its drooping socket, as its face began to melt and peel, like a dolly representation of a human, the other glistening with pain and hate. The face, its melting mockery of Chelsea's face, drooped with a surreal, pain-like effect. I struggle still to describe what lay beneath. It was like a hyper-realistic depiction of a child drawing of a human face. A nose that was merely a pair of small holes. Its eyes, 2 pinpoints in a swollen, rigid skull reminiscent of a pumpkin. Even still, a smile stretched across its charred features, half with its own small mouth, the other with what remained of its mirage. "Go," I sputtered, spraying another burst of flame in its direction. It hissed but didn't step forward. I heard a groan from the owl beside us. Its singular eye darted to the side, and it cocked its head to the right, listening for something that I couldn't hear. It shuddered, chattering angrily, before speaking what I thought were its final words to me. "Need David. Go find you, David." It struggled to put the words together, but made sure its point was clear. And with that, it scurried off, disappearing down the aisles and towards the exit, leaving me frozen in horror and disbelief. The sound of things falling to the ground in the aisle beside me made my heart lurch, and it reminded me of Chelsea. I hurried over, still clutching my impromptu flamethrower as I rounded the shelf. She lay in a heap on the ground, curled up in a half-fetal position. Recognition bloomed through the initial fear in her eyes as she saw me, and she hurried to her feet, brushing forward. Claw marks gouged her face and she shook wildly, but appeared otherwise okay. "Matt, I have to go find Matt." She hurried past me towards the back door into the dumpsters. I followed and we hurried through the small stockroom and out the back of the store. I didn't see anything at first, but Chelsea cried out and rushed out, or towards the dumpster where I saw a pair of legs stretched out from behind it. Matt, get up, Matt." My heart dropped as I saw him, the panic in her voice and his utter stillness, as well as the look of him, making me think the worst. His face was scarred, deep gashes digging through half of it as though he had been mauled. Strange scars patterned his visible skin. My heart dropped. In the distance, an approaching siren blared. Matthew coughed. "Holy crap," I breathed. "He's alive." Chelsea did her best not to let panic override her, still practically hyperventilating as Matt's eyes slowly began to flutter open. Dark blood spurted from his mouth as he slurred his words. His eyes seemed to lock on me. The sirens grew nearer. You're okay. Wait for the ambulance." He coughed again. "There's a man, you have to." "It's fine, we're fine, he's gone." I could hear faint conversation from within the store, the sirens coming to a halt at the front, the glow of emergency lights lighting up the night. The rest of the night went by in a relative blur. We all spoke to the police, giving our accounts of the night's events, leaving nothing out despite the insanity of it all, and the looks that it garnered. The security footage was abuzz, the cameras and corresponding computers all fried somehow when the power went out. A random power surge, they say, but I know better. Matthew denied emergency medical, citing a lack of insurance, and Chelsea followed his lead, so after a few hours of questioning, the police and EMTs had all left the lot. The store was closed for the rest of the night, but given that little was broken after a meager phone call with the manager, apologizing for our trauma and offering a temporary increase to our employee benefits, the matter was considered resolved. "Let the other two know when you see them. I'm not getting an answer," he told me, and I agreed to, tired to do otherwise. Despite it all, I returned to work the next day. After all, trauma and sob stories, no matter how reasonable, don't pay the rent. Neither would employee discounts. I was content to try and erase the night's events from my mind, acting as if none of it had ever occurred. But recent events have deemed that impossible. You see, I thought nothing of Matthew and Chelsea's absence the rest of that week. Sure, I found it odd how none of my calls to either of them were answered, but we all cope with trauma differently. However, last night, almost a week after the ordeal, I received a call that has made it so I can't feel safe returning to work. I don't feel safe at all. My manager called me before my latest shift, the tone in his voice immediately making my stomach bubbling with an odd sort of anxiety. The cops are looking to speak to Chelsea if you've heard from her. He had begun. Someone found a body in the bog near the store. I'm sorry, I know you guys were close, but it was Matt's. I felt cold and hollow, as though every ounce of blood had evaporated into an icy mist in my veins. They say that he's been there for about a week. I think they suspect maybe she had something to do with it. Brought him back here that night, I don't know. Anyways, you can take some time off. When the call ended, I sat frozen with the phone to my ear, letting the dial tone blare as my mind raced, his words echoing in my mind with cavernous effect. He's been there for about a week. I had seen Matt that night, we both had. I watched him and Chelsea drive off that night. Like a flashback, my mind replayed the image of that thing and the appearance of Chelsea peering at me. I had seen something that looked like Matt, a quiet, mangled version of him at that. My heart pumped panic through me as awful connections began to form. Suddenly, Chelsea and Matthew's complete radio silence made awful sense, and that thing's a threat bears new weight. I believe Chelsea's dead by now, unfortunately. Matthew too. I don't think I'll be returning to work for a while, if ever. The paranoia has gotten overwhelming. I see monsters in every shadow, hear approaching death in the creak of every floorboard. Heck, even as I write this in my room, beside the window carrying in the late-night breeze, I can't help but feel that I can smell the faint but growing scent of rot in the air. God help me.